Bless up for tuning in to Project Chaney. Magic happens when you question everything. Conspirituality becomes reality, weirdness is welcomed, and it's okay to change your mind. Big up yourself.
Everyone, please welcome Mystic Mark from My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And he is here to join me to talk about Aleister Crowley. And I am really excited to hang out with you today. And I'm also weirdly excited to talk about Aleister Crowley. How are you? Welcome to Project Chaney.
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here again, right? This is my second time on your show. I hope to have you on my show very soon, and I hope to release this as a swapcast later on after you've released it, because I'm very excited about this topic. I, for folks who don't know, had a sort of charged and exciting conversation about Aleister Crowley with my dear friend Sam Tripoli almost 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago now. And especially given the atmosphere of the time, Sam was very much combative towards the latter part of our conversation. Obviously, him and I are friends, so it wasn't relationship altering, but I hadn't known him for that long. So in my mind, I was like, oh God, is this the end of my very short career with Sam? Luckily it wasn't. And he understood my point. But what frustrated him was I gave him a very neutral perspective of Aleister Crowley, mostly because I wasn't willing to just say he's all bad. And when you asked me to go and do this research, I decided again, okay, is Crowley bad? Let's try to ask this question. Let's try to find a real answer. And although he may have been an evil person, so to speak, for the times that he was in, I don't know if the modern person would consider him evil for maybe the reasons why we would assume. From our modern perspective, he probably would have fit right in. Some of the things that he would have been alienated for would have been maybe more of his political and racial ideas, which were very much of his time, being a British man, thinking he was superior than women and anyone who wasn't white. So, I mean, there are many reasons to despise Crowley, but there are also some reasons to give him a the benefit of the doubt, and B, a sort of slight gratitude, because in a weird way, if he hadn't lived the crazy life he lived and exposed some of this stuff through his writings, I feel personally that we would be dealing with a scarier world. Let me explain what I mean by that. Crowley, at the behest of his peers, published a lot of things that his peers, would have liked kept secret. And, you know, with these occult powers that have sort of commercialized themselves and are now used by, you know, Fortune 500 companies to manipulate us into buying their products and into subliminally marketing towards us, right? I mean, these tactics, those occult tactics, might not have been as evident to us if it wasn't for types like Crowley in his day, who spent a great deal of time writing all this stuff out. And like him or not, he possibly had that benefit to the world of being this revealer, and he very much thought of himself as this revealer, right? And maybe that was a sort of personal ego, a personal flaw of his. Again, there are a lot of reasons to dislike Crowley, especially when you look at his personal life and his personality and his tastes. They definitely border on abusive and gross, just to put it mildly. And other than those sort of more human evils that he was certainly a part of, at the time, he generated this tremendous interest in these subjects. And I don't know for certain, but I think he did a great deal of exposing things that would have remained secret to this day without him. So I guess that would be my only kind of don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, statement about Crowley. But yeah, that's kind of where I started with all this. And I also wanted to give people a fair look at Crowley. Now, for anyone who's just coming to this, with no firsthand knowledge of it, this might be a better conversation to listen to. If someone's very serious about learning about Crowley, all my information comes from Tobias Churton, Richard Spence, who I've interviewed on my show, Lauren Sutton, and then a few, random things here and there on the internet. So, if you're very serious about learning about Crowley, Tobias Churton has written 6 or 7 biographies about Crowley, all different aspects of his life. And Richard Spence has written a book specifically about Crowley's espionage career, or alleged espionage career. And I really think that's where he was most diabolical, was with his connections to the intelligence community. Occult stuff aside, his occult kind of things really only affected the people who were stupid enough to stick around him. Like, for example, Victor Neuberg, who we'll talk about later on, who unfortunately was taken advantage of from Crowley, and he used him financially speaking, and also sexually, and did all of these occult rituals with this poor guy who ended up in a sort of insane asylum, in shambles, not a healthy person after his relationship with Aleister Crowley. And that's because Aleister Crowley was very ego driven in his occult aspirations. He wanted to be this great prophet of the new aeon that he foresaw. So that being said, how does a person like Crowley come to be, right? How do we get a person like Crowley? I'll share
before we go all the way into it. I have to tell my audience, the episode you were on of Tinfoil Hat is really one of the great episodes in podcasting, because you can hear Sam go through this emotional trigger of a subject, and you can hear you just try to relay the information unbiasedly. You're like, I'm just trying to give you the facts of the information. But in myself, of my own shadow work, of going through the whole journey of different subjects that I've looked into and not, sometimes the most triggering subjects I wasn't ready to hear yet, because I didn't have all the tools. Or you're looking into dangerous subject matter that you don't have all the protections, you don't have all the, there's just things that people have to be ready for with certain amounts of knowledge, I think. And I liked Sam's emotional triggers of it, because so frequently in life, our emotions make us not hear the information. We're so blocked. That's our feminine is so blocked by it that we just can't hear the logical. We just can't hear it. And so I think this is one of those subjects that's so triggering to people. They're like, man, I won't even listen to this episode, because I won't even listen to a thing about Aleister Crowley. And it's just like the same as all these crazy subjects, or kind of sometimes horrific conspiracies. It's like, no, there's so much information here. And some things about Aleister Crowley, I think you could really relate to. And some things are horrific. And I just try to get to this spot now, objectivity, of being objective, that I can stand back and I could say, but now let me look at it from this way. Like I used to just be like, fags out in the desert. But now I can actually look at it from a different way of okay, sex magic. I didn't even believe in that term when I first met about Aleister Crowley. So it's just that episode for me is a really big deal on conspiracies, because I think sometimes we have to get over our emotion of things to get real facts of it. Right. To hear them, to have the ears to hear. So you did such a good job. I thought I knew you at that time too, when I listened to that episode. And so it was like that anxiety of listening to my friend who on a show at the time, like, oh my gosh. And I could hear you like keeping your cool, but I didn't even know you were nervous. And I would have been like, I would have broken down, like, never mind. I can't even do this anymore. And I thought you did a good job at getting through the information. And so, yeah, I wore, my tinfoil hat shirt today for my video listeners for that episode. Because in all this realm of podcasting, it's in really one of my top 10 that I think people need to go back and listen to. So,
yeah, I'm really flattered to hear that, because I don't I don't ever go into a podcast without feeling somewhat nervous, and I'm especially nervous on a platform like Sam's. Yeah, I got a lot of interesting comments after that tinfoil hat episode. You know, a lot of people were very upset with my take on it, and kind of parroted Sam's argument, and then there were others who championed my argument to the point where I disagreed with them,
they were
which
like,
is
hey,
funny.
hey, hey.
Yeah, which is it very interesting, because we do have a lot of proponents of Crowley today, right? Many more so than when he was alive. I think we have more proponents when he's passed than when he was alive, because he wasn't really a good friend to many of the people that he was close with. So um
And
I
for
think
anyone out there who comes across this, just because people are looking into things or they're educated about things, it doesn't mean they're a worshiper of things. Like, look at Mark and his vibe and his chill. Like I mean, I don't want to say he's not practicing at the Church of Thelema or the Golden Dawn, but
well, I could say I'm not. So
okay, I didn't want to speak for you, but it's just like a lot of the times I think people hear information about things and they assume like I want to know everything about space and flat earth so I can make my decision on it.
Oh
Like,
yeah. Oh yeah. I
like
love that. Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because and even the part about what you said before about, I didn't even know that sex magic was a thing. Well, I think that's because we've been conditioned with holidays like Halloween and all of the movies that come along with that ritualized event each year. We've been conditioned to think magic is something that is so much far removed from normal, ordinary life, when in actuality, every single day you experience some form of magic. You've just been conditioned to not notice it, right? I mean, our own dreams are the best example of that. Unless you're, like me and you're a pothead and don't remember your dreams. I mean, dreams are probably the most magical part of your existence in a way, in a sort of funny way of looking at it. They go unappreciated, certainly in our modern era, but we spend such a significant portion of our lives sleeping that we can't discount our dream life as a part of our human experience. And dreams are always magical. We have a magic logic in dreams. And what I mean by magic logic is like a logic that defies waking consciousness. And around the time that Aleister Crowley was alive, this was all very much becoming a part of the mainstream. We have the occult revival, which was sort of after the Enlightenment, after that Renaissance kind of ideas, the freedom that people had after thousands of years of suppression of these ideas. And there's a certain, argument to be made that, okay, well, maybe the Church of Rome and the Catholics, maybe they were burning people at the stake to protect us from the occult, because, we don't want the occult. It's a bad thing. It leads to bad things. That argument is certainly somewhat substantial. But then there's the historical approach, which shows that the occult was alive in the Church of Rome and the Church of the Vatican, and the Catholic Church. So you have to, I guess, take the like red and blue goggles off for this conversation, and just because duality is very much a part of our existence. But to your point, we can't let it supersede this, I guess, dive into the facts, right? Because the facts, we can have a certain opinion about them, but they are what they are. And the further back you go, the murkier it gets. And Crowley, relatively, didn't exist that long ago. I actually share the birthday, well, somewhat. He was born October 12th. I was born October 11th. And I
Oh, sure,
kind of
sure.
found that interesting. And Crowley himself had a similar thing like that. He noticed that he was born the same year Eliphas Levi, famous occultist, died. And he was also born the same year that famous Madame Petrova Blavatsky started her theosophical organization. So, Crowley obviously didn't notice that immediately, but sometime after, when he was a young adult, he said to himself, oh, wow, maybe this is a sign that I am meant to look into this magical stuff. And being that he was born to the Plymouth Brethren sect, which I'll share my screen now. We'll kind of
Yes, yes, yes. A young Edward.
we'll get the videos and whatnot, or the video listeners sort of tantalized here. So there's Crowley in his famous hat. Here's the sort of quick 101 English occultist, intelligence agent. I added that in there. You will not find that in his proper Wikipedia, because, well, I don't think they want you to really know that that was a big part of his life. But Tobias Churton and Richard Spence have almost proven that in their books. Ceremonial magician, poet, painter, novelist, and mountaineer. He founded the religion of Thelema, and he initiated the Aeon of Horus, at least in his mind. So we know him as the Beast, and he got that from his mother, who had a very hard time keeping tabs on him after his father died, right? So Crowley's father dies when he's 11 of tongue cancer. And it's interesting, at that period in time, they did have more modern treatments for cancer, and he was very he was adamant that his father's religious orientation killed him, because the Plymouth Brethren sect, discouraged any medicine from the doctors. They had, so much faith that they decided, no, we're going to heal him with our faith. So when that didn't work, Crowley blamed this religion, the Christians, for his father's passing at only 11 years old. I mean, this really changed him forever, and is probably why, he felt such a openness to the occult growing up in England, where you had, a variety of different sects of Christianity, different degrees of depravity, some very chaste and some very, not so chaste. I don't know the proper word, but
Didn't he get called, was there a painting or a book? Like his mom pointed out something specifically and was like, this is why you're the Beast.
Well, yeah, they were very much, by the book biblical Christians. So she just quoted scripture at him and called him the Beast 666 because, allegedly Crowley was caught having sex with one of their housemaids at maybe like 13 or 14, not exactly like unusually young to be sexually active, but pretty young for someone to become sexually active, especially with an adult. That's a rumor. I haven't found that substantiated in his proper biographies, but allegedly that was, either that or just his sort of rebellious, youthful nature that got him to be called the Beast.
I've heard the thing in between too, like he went to his uncle's, like after his dad died, he went to his uncle's, and his uncle had like the woods and guns and shovels and axes, and like he could be a boy for the first time, like play and roughhouse and learn things. And this is where he got like this huge skill set. And so then he gets back to his mom's, and she has a housekeeper, and so he sleeps with her and impregnates her and puts her on the streets because you can't be a pregnant unwed lady, and that she's the first victim of Jack the Ripper.
Right. And I did talk about that on Sam's show, and I didn't include that in the slides just because I hadn't found that corroborated more than once. There's only one source for that information, at least,
Okay.
original source. But that still, I mean, it's a tantalizing fact, possible fact. It's said about Crowley. It definitely adds to his legend. Um, I feel a little guilty and maybe silly of repeating stuff like that without actually going and seeing, where it's cited. I think that's really important, especially if we're going to call ourselves conspiracy theorists, because a lot of disinformation gets spread about. And I unwittingly have, pronounced disinformation at times. It's just a byproduct of this type of research, unfortunately. But yeah, the Beast moniker, he definitely owned it, whether it was because of the, sleeping with the maid or just his general, rebelliousness. He owned that name, and really appreciated it. He actually, it's funny, he did like the Bible. He did like Christianity. It wasn't that, Christians killed his father, so now he hated Christianity. He hated the fact that his mother seemed like, this, unthinking slave to Christianity, whereas father had more, prestige about him. And his father really instilled this sense of aristocracy in him. And, Crowley was sort of like, you know, to himself in school. He went to several different schools, one of which he was abused by a guy that later he helped get arrested. His uncle, who was a sort of bully to him, you know, did one good thing, redeeming thing, and helped him out with that. This guy Champney, a reverend who Crowley claimed was a sadist. And this is interesting because he goes to this school because he was misbehaving at other schools. He has this very uh, strict teacher, reverend, and Crowley gets out of it, right? Where maybe mean parents would have left him in that school. His parents took him out of it, and not only did they take him out of it, they actually got that reverend in trouble. So, this shows not only is Crowley sort of in an upper echelon of society where his family has some sway, but he also has this sort of calculating, manipulative nature to him. And one has to wonder if, this sort of sadistic, masochistic element of his sex magic came from experiences like this as a child, where he was probably beaten or whipped or something by this reverend at a boarding school. Definitely helped him justify his foray into the seedy underground of London. He got gonorrhea at a very young age after meeting a friend who kind of took him around the underbelly of that area. And that's kind of where his teenage years end and his young adulthood begins. He finds a love for mountaineering at that time when he kind of is at, I forget which school. It says right here, Eastbourne College.
I think it's interesting too. Like he was like a chess champion. He was
Right.
extremely intelligent, because I don't know if IQ tests are real. I don't know really what is a mark of intelligence, but if you are a chess champion, there is a way that you understand theory of things and that your brain works, that it's like he did understand next level of things. This chess comes up in a lot of these people that I look into of recent, which by the way, I've seen you with Juan and stuff and doing that kind of research with Paranoid American and the John D and it's like there's so many other characters besides the Aleister Crowley just to go off on. But I always find the chess to be very a curious link between all of them. But I do think there's a game theory idea with it.
Yeah, I really like that. I didn't put much thought into that, but yeah, he was a chess player. That was something that he spent a lot of time doing at Cambridge. He also spent a lot of time with prostitutes, and he didn't spend much time with his classmates. He was sort of again to himself when he was at school. And I think he thought of himself as above other people to some degree, whether that was because of his family. I mean, he came from a sort of wealthy family, but it's a complicated social status scene in Britain at the time. His family were brewers, which was looked down upon. It wasn't considered like an aristocracy thing to have made a lot of money selling beer, right? It was considered like the commoners drank beer, the aristocrats didn't drink beer. So he kind of kept to himself, although he did feel inwardly like I'm special. He wouldn't have got that kind of recognition from his peers, especially when they heard his name, Crowley, or Crowley, which is how it was pronounced, because Crowley was also associated with the beer. There was Crowley beer practically across the country. It was
It was like having a lot of money and being in a private school, but your parents are like mafia. They're
it's
like
on like a trash company or something.
yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's and I think that's it's interesting too that at Cambridge he allegedly gets tapped or pulled into these espionage circles, which would have been something that was very appropriate for someone of a certain social status. Like spies at that time were not necessarily recruited solely from the military or like militias or even people who were going into politics. They would take literature students, journalists, all these sort of different types of people and have them on the attache for an intelligent officer. They'd serve as an agent, even if it was only once or twice. Like it was sort of like um like a service to the intelligence. Well, I'm sorry, it was like a patriotic service of the like upper echelon, right? You weren't low enough to go and grab a gun and be enlisted, but you were still patriotic to serve, so you served in a different way.
And you might run one or two operations.
Right, as a spy, you have like a contact who was an official officer, like someone who actually went through the military to be a spy or trained spies. But you yourself as a spy were not someone who like was enlisted as a soldier. So Crowley being a spy,
I think actually even like the truth in plain sight kind of this day of how you would use somebody of an upper echelon is like Sean Penn being the last person with El Chapo, or Pamela Anderson being the last person with Julian Assange.
well,
like
and
you have that little mix between where they also say like certain bands are just drug running. They go on these big tours because no one checks their tour buses.
yeah, and this was at a time, when we didn't have the celebrity culture that we do now. The focus was still on royalty, politicians, maybe the musicians, but again, like
maybe like Houdini, maybe Charlie Chaplin.
right.
Like,
Yeah,
maybe
the arts were still a thing of like high society, and yeah, entertainment was like carnival-esque still. And yeah, it's interesting to see how like Crowley influenced that 60s generation of what would become kind of like fringe celebrities, but we're not there yet. So Crowley has kind of changing a turning point in Stockholm, and some people explain this as him having his first same-sex sexual experience, right? And you got to keep in mind at that time homosexuality was not wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal. You could be arrested if someone were to find out that you were in a same-sex relationship. So that was sort of the I think it was a turning point for him mentally, but it was also like an initiation into something that to him was extremely important. And it's even written about like an initiation. I don't know if he was actually initiated into a certain order, but you do have this homoeroticism that it's present in various secret societies that Crowley may or may not have been exposed to in a place like Stockholm. You have to imagine some of these secret societies were associated with sailing and the trade, right? The commercial, mercantile class, this group of sailors, and you have a bunch of men on a ship with no ladies, that kind of thing is going to happen. And some authors have even written that it's a ritualized thing where the captain has, a cabin boy, and this is maybe the pedophilic aspect to it all. And at this time, Crowley, he was a fan of poetry. He was reading this sort of homosexual, homoerotic poetry. I don't know if Oscar Wilde was much older than him, but he was certainly around later in the story, and that kind of comes into play because Oscar Wilde famously was put on trial for his homosexuality, and he was a poet and a mystic as well. So, homosexuality was sort of a thing within this mystic community. That's something that maybe we don't think about nowadays, considering like the political changes that have gone on, and now it's obviously more open and accepted, and especially so in the past 5 or so years. At least the politically active folks are very.
And I thought about this. I was thinking about it with Aleister Crowley in general, and just trying to contradict my own thoughts with certain things, and like just thinking, okay, what if he wasn't a homosexual? And everybody always has that idea of like, you build one bridge, you're not a bridge builder, but you suck one cock, you're a cocksucker. And so it is that idea even in the homosexual community. And it's so weird, like if everyone just thinks about it in their world, you can be a girl drunk in college and make out with 10 girls and no one will ever think you're a lesbian. But the same thing doesn't happen for men. But take the sexuality out of it all, or you kind of have to leave it there. But if you kind of take the idea of whatever the straightest female is, it isn't for the straightest female. If somebody held a gun to her head and was like, you have to let this woman eat your pussy right now. I'm sorry if you don't talk like this on your podcast, but you have to do this. It, like, for that woman, it morally, if she was like of certain religions, it might be hard for her, but it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Whereas for a man to have to, the straightest man in the world, whatever that means, and I'm not, if Kinsey Scale's real or not, for him to have to go through the same act to separate himself from his flesh and his morals, that's where this level of magic comes in, and intention. That could you be doing this? Because then when you actually think of anal sex, now it doesn't matter if you're a woman or a man. It is this quote unquote portal that is unnatural for us to do this thing. It doesn't matter what flesh suit you are in this lifetime. So magically, it just seems like to separate yourself from your flesh in ritual. There's levels to it of things that I'm sure you'll get into later on with other magical stuff, but just a philosophy that I was kind of thinking of separating it. Like, could this not be a sexual thing? Could this just be a magic thing of a way of like, no, this body doesn't matter. I can feel pain in this way. I can feel a bite in this way. I can cut myself in this way. I own this flesh.
Given the cultural suppression of it, it would have been akin to like, breaking the law by doing graffiti in a certain way, or like, stealing a car, I mean, to a certain extent, as far as society was concerned, if you remove the very personal, romantic aspects of it, potentially, I'm sure the thrill of it would have been, akin to
breaking the law.
Something like that, right? I mean, you have to imagine, and also you're risking all of society exiling or shaming you too. I mean, there's obviously a certain thrill there. I mean, I'm not in the kink communities.
No, and me either. I'm trying to like hit it from all.
Of it. Yeah, because he's a part of this, like, open, like these things were present in the human psyche, and figures like Crowley kind of open the door to them. And were very much a part of this, now new modern world that we're in, for worse or for better. And I think it's odd because Crowley politically was very conservative, and the people who champion his sort of like sexual openness would have totally despised his political and racial opinions. I mean, for one thing, he was a white supremacist who regarded, anybody who wasn't in the upper classes as less than even white people, right? But when he traveled, he'd go to China or he'd go to India, he wouldn't ever fraternize with anyone below a certain class level. He regarded them as, subhuman. He writes like that in some of his writings, which, again, he's a person of his time. This wasn't like his invention to think that way. It was a product of the time he was in, very much like the suppression of homosexuality was a just a thing of the time that he was in. So to him, maybe it was more of a radical spiritual experience because of that as well. Like, and it wasn't so much that he was, naturally inclined to be homosexual, because he never, he did marry women. I mean, it wasn't that he only exclusively was in relationships with men.
Well, and we just blanket the Werner von Braun, Parsons, Disney, and we're all like homosexuals. But I was just thinking, like, I am obviously not a straight man, but I am a lesbian. And for me, if somebody was like, okay, the next part, if I was in some fraternal order, sorority or something, and they were like, the next part of your thing is we're going to go to the desert and you're going to get anal penetration by a man, it would be just as breaking for me as I imagine you. So it's like at some point, it's like there's a separation of even a gay and straight of whatever it is they're practicing in, because I don't believe all these dudes that are in this high level occult, that may or may not come up later on in this conversation, I don't think they were all homosexual.
Right.
Like,
and
but I do think they were all practicing levels of magic that might have involved homosexual sex.
Right. Yeah. And I'm really appreciating your perspective and having that perspective to contribute, because I mean, as a straight white man, it's a touchy subject for me to exclusively comment on, but together we definitely can have a different perspective. And yeah, I agree. I'm not going into some desert.
No, we'd hold hands and I'd make eye contact with you and I would have tears come down my eyes, and
like, hold hands and break out of there.
We'd embrace later and we'd be like, we don't have to tell anyone.
Oh man. Well, I mean, after we get to the later portion of this conversation, I don't know how excited you're going to be about that.
I hope I become magical. I hope a wand gets delivered in the mail.
Well, and that's a really good point to make, because if you look at the more modern takes on these subjects, what do you have? You have tantric sex, you have like this sort of kundalini yoga that can border on cult-like sexual activity.
Moon children, like where people are actually doing their full sexual thing to have a child.
We're here now, so I'll just say it now. Crowley actually was not a fan of Parsons or Hubbard. He was alive until 1947, so he was sort of, I mean, he was at the end of his life and had done a lot of drugs, heroin and other drugs by then. So, his mind wasn't the same as it was when he initially started writing all this stuff, but he was not like a proponent of their moonchild ritual. He actually said that they were fools and that they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. And I think that's coming from someone who had probably been beaten down quite a bit by his, flippancy with the occult. I mean, not to put it lightly, you're playing with these dark, huge, immense, catastrophic at times forces and asking them to be a part of your life. I mean, it's going to chew you up and spit you out. And this isn't my opinion. I'm standing on the shoulders of many different occults, researchers who have said things like this, and Crowley himself probably would have said it if he had a sober mind to do so. But like I said, Crowley, he got around. He had a lot of prostitutes that were part of his regular life. I think he said something like, a man shouldn't go 48 hours without having sex. So, he was always focused on sex, and it he paid the cost. He had syphilis and gonorrhea, and at the time, I mean, historically speaking, if you got one of those diseases, it could have a bad effect on your mind. I mean, look at the guy who killed all those killed all those, innocent people in the Congo, the Dutch, royal who had, venereal diseases and whatnot. I mean, he was completely insane.
Oh yeah, it's like I worked in nursing homes for a long time, and it's a really well-known thing that any old person, if they just get a UTI or just a bladder infection, something that seems so little, it will make them go crazy. They will start like tripping.
Wow.
And so I can only imagine what long-term set in of these sexually transmitted diseases from back then, or infections, what
Yeah.
would happen mentally to people.
Yeah, and Crowley didn't live an especially long life. I mean, he could have lived until the 60s if he was healthier. But yeah, so Crowley had a couple of interesting and unaccounted for trips to Russia that sort of give away the fact that he was most likely helping out the British Secret Service. Russia at the time, this is the early 1900s, so there's all this, revolutionary activity going on in Russia. Britain was very worried about what would happen with Russia, and Britain had their fingers in almost every portion of the world trying to control and manage things. I mean, they had agents and officers throughout all of their colonies. So Crowley wasn't like, part of some top level spy division. He was more of a run of the mill spy, I think, that probably became privy to some secret society stuff that the average person wouldn't have, and that enticed him to go further. But
Do you think he hung out with Rasputin at all during this time, or any of that kind of
oh,
clique?
well, I mean, this is Tobias Churton's claim, and I trust his research. He says that Rasputin, and actually Richard Spence says this too, that Rasputin wasn't even in the same part of Russia when Crowley was there, and Crowley was very young and still naive at that time. So if he did meet Rasputin, it wouldn't have impressed Rasputin at all. I think that guy was like having children at the time that Crowley was going to Russia, and he lived somewhere like very far in the east of Russia, not anywhere near the western frontier.
And do you think Crowley at all was enough into the occult? Because I know he like the pyramids and stuff later on. Do you think he was enough into the architecture of it that he might have, and elite enough that he might have, and this is like a far-fetched breadcrumb, have been onto Tatarian building idea, that he might have been searching for other kind of architectural magic or things, or he wasn't that deep yet?
No, I don't think Crowley was concerned with architecture at all. I mean, if you look at his what he's written about, he's very much focused on ceremonial magic, which,
Mhm.
it does involve being in a temple and having temple space, but that is a conceptual temple. It's not like it doesn't have a physical specification that's required. He did do the channelings in the pyramid, so
Mhm.
obviously he had some sort of knowledge of what the pyramids might do, but if anything, that would have been more for the historical, metaphysical, mythological qualities, not just I mean, I'm not trying to rain on the Tartaria parade. I just feel like a lot of the Tartaria stuff uh is it's exclusive to a specific part of pre-Columbian American history that we don't know a lot about. So it really doesn't have any pull on Crowley, who lived in the late 19th and early 20th century. By then, Tartaria and the Great Reset would have been properly hidden away, if we're to believe that the Tartaria stuff was written out of history, right? I
Well,
mean,
aren't the world fairs come up late, like in the next period of
he was.
Crowley's life?
I mean, the first World Fair was in the 1700s. So the World's Fair were definitely around when he was alive, and I think he even visited a couple of the World's Fairs. But that being said, the World's Fairs, in my opinion, are a byproduct of the growing corporatocracy, corporate power system that was, a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution and the consolidation of power of Europe from the traditionally religious royal structures to a more economic university intelligentsia type structure, right? The World's Fair is like the royal family saying, okay, we're not going to hide behind the reins of the throne anymore. We're going to hide behind the reins of the dollar. We're going to hide behind the reins of industry. We're going to control industry. And the World's Fair was pivotal in bringing forth this industrial enslavement that we're all in. I mean, if you look at Ford and his idea of, pay for your car so then you can pay for the gas to come to work to keep your car running. I mean, the whole thing is just a ploy to keep you stuck with one, with one company, right? I mean, obviously that didn't pan out to what he wanted, this utopia of like enslavement under a corporate power structure, but it's on its way there in a more diverse way. I mean, yeah.
I always think they two birds, one stone. I think they're doing exactly what you're saying, like where they use it to like look at this popular idea of these rubber tires by Firestone on this Ford car and Flagler and Edison, and they're going to drive cross country and it's so dreamy. Like they totally do this. And like, look at this beautiful building and this electricity. We're going to run into your town and look how well it works. Like they sell the ideas through it. But then the like idea of like stolen technology also being turned off with it. I didn't know if there's is this the time where the Great Reset kind of happened, like this tink 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 tink, where they like stole some, and would this elite class have a little bit of the info, like have a little bit of the like we go still party in these buildings that we know are this, but I didn't even know if he was there yet.
Crowley definitely had, like many people at the time, an idea of Atlantis as a great lost civilization, and some people even thought about like Shambhala being this like hidden civilization that was, somewhere on the planet that hadn't been discovered or acknowledged yet. So those kind of ideas that were later evolved into the Tartaria propaganda, because a lot of it is disinformation, unfortunately, as interesting as it is.
I like ancient technology. I like
technology.
It's like the just blanket idea, because it's like when Tatarian, Lemurian, Atlantean, Egyptian, Aztecs. It's like once you start breaking up these civilizations, it's like, oh, there's stolen technology and architecture everywhere, and civilizations have been built on top of civilizations everywhere. But it's not all just this one thing.
Yeah. Well, I think Crowley unfortunately would have been on the side of the folks who were keeping a lot of that type of information away from us. It wasn't his interest, though, like the technology and science. I mean, he was interested in chemistry when he was in school, but only because it related to alchemy, and he recognized that. I mean, he was consumed with his own power, and theosophy at the time was obsessed with this idea that we human beings are like supermen and superwomen that are like just in a state of amnesia, and we don't recognize our true powers, which, it's not an idea invented by the theosophists. It was just sort of like repackaged by them. But when you look at that concept, it made way for everything in our media. Superheroes. I mean, you're familiar with Chris Knowles. He's written a book, Our Gods Wear Spandex, and how they use all these mythological concepts veiled as like superheroes and then present them to us in superhero movies. Well, Crowley was one of these thinkers that really like brought those ideas to literature, to printed paper. and inspired, the guys that were drawing the comic books in the 60s and so on. But Crowley's influences, they were more arcane, more obscure, some like things that we would consider like historically relevant to esotericism, but like hard to get into. Like Crowley, I think, did a service in the sense that he helped make a lot of these arcane, very dense, cryptic, metaphysical treatises and occult, texts from the medieval and earlier periods. He made them more approachable to the modern mind, and tried to take what he would of that in a sort of Bruce Lee, Jeet Kune Do kind of way, and take what he could get the most out of, right? And I think that's a very modern way of doing things.
He seasoned the meat. He took this like raw meat and then just like seasoned it and made it palatable.
Right. And as I have here on the slide, A.E. Waite, who was a sort of scholar of the occult and esoteric world before Crowley was around. He might have been alive when Crowley was around. I think they wrote letters to one another, but that inspired him, along with a couple other strange books like The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary by Carl von Eckartshausen. So like things that we wouldn't see in our bookstores today, things that exist in like rare archives and book collections. But one thing that is
You have them?
No.
Oh, you seem like you have rare archive and book collection.
I do have rare books. I do. I just wouldn't want to tell you which ones, but I can't.
You're like, I don't want those people coming to my house. People that know rare books.
I'll tell you after our recording what I got. I trust you. But so one thing I can't skip past is around this time, Crowley wrote a series of poetry that is just really disturbing, especially to like our modern sensibility to a certain extent after the whole, pedogate stuff. I mean, it makes Crowley seem very much like someone who would have inspired the Kinsey in pedophile pediatric kind of creeps that came very much after Crowley was dead. But I don't know if, again, that was so much Crowley's invention as it was a byproduct of the subculture that he was a part of. I mean, homosexuality was illegal, so
what you're doing as thy wilt, keep
Yeah.
pushing. It's like if you're not homosexual and practicing an anal sex, what's the next line? What's the next line? What's the next line?
Well, and I'm in no way an expert, but from what I've heard through various podcasts, comedy, otherwise, just cultural interest, it seems like there's a propensity in the male gay culture for like very young men to kind of get involved, maybe with much older men than
twinks.
Yeah, and I think that was a theme back then, and something he wrote about in his poetry, and it definitely makes him look like a pedophile. I mean, that's why when I had that conversation with Sam, I had to bring that up, because when you look at Tobias Churton, who spent a lot of time writing about him, Tobias, he takes his life and looks at his life, but he doesn't take a look at that writing. And of course, Tobias isn't an all-seeing being. He can't like go back in time and know everything Crowley did. He's just going off of what was available in writing and what he can pick up. So I'm sure there were things that Crowley did in secret, in the dark, that we would, think are heinous and gross. I mean, but I think that's true for a lot of famous people, unfortunately. And I think that's something that people have to come to grips with, is that to degrees, everyone has skeletons in their closet. And that is in no way a justification for something as disgusting as, abusing a child. But the fact that he's written about that in his poetry, I think, especially at that young age, shows that maybe something either happened to him or he was present in a scene where that was more accepted. And again, he was somewhat of an elite. He went to Cambridge, and we are told that the royals have a certain propensity to not only abuse children, but straight up kill them. So I don't know if Crowley maybe was taking some of the things that he had learned from that atmosphere and packaging them into his early poetry, but it's from someone with our perspective of, like, the situation in the Franklin scandal and everything that we've heard about since Pizzagate. I mean,
Jimmy Savile.
Jimmy Savile is the best. I mean, thank you for bringing that up, because that is specifically in England, where he was sometime, obviously, after Crowley had passed away. But still, I mean, not very long after Crowley passes away, you have this Jimmy Savile guy kind of becoming like a pop figure, pop icon over there. So yeah, there's a connection. I think authors like Johnny Cerrucci might be, or like there's another guy, Philip Fairbanks. These two guys, they have the stomach that I do not have to go and do that kind of research. I would be totally appalled to go and try to track that down. Also, I'm not a private detective or anything like that, so I don't have the formal skills to like go and look at something like that. But from my armchair research perspective, I do think there is a case to be made that Crowley had a strange sexual appetite, and maybe that involved people underage. But then again, we're talking about someone who's born in the late 1800s. So the sexual laws and everything was very different back then. I mean, back then there were people who were married to 12-year-olds, by arranged marriage. So it was a different world. That being said,
And that was happening in America.
yeah,
That
well,
wasn't like just any country. Like in the early 1900s, 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds were getting married in this country.
Yeah. So, and England probably would have been very similar. And, this is all we're looking at Crowley so far as he was in England, and he kind of traveled a lot, being a mountain climber. And as someone who's hiked a couple mountains, it's definitely a spiritual experience, getting to the top. So I think, there is a benevolent side of him too. I mean, he wasn't exclusively doing things in the dark. He had normal interests like mountaineering, and he was pretty good at it, given that he was born with, I think, some sort of chronic illness, and then he also developed asthma. Mountaineering was probably really helpful for him to get over that. And yeah, I mentioned Crowley was a spy, an agent, and Tobias Churton and Rick Spence suggests that Crowley's foray into the Golden Dawn was not so much because of his occult interests, but more to spy and maybe even disrupt the Order of the Golden Dawn.
Did he hike Everest?
No, he made an attempt on K2, which is one of the Himalayan mountains. I don't think it's the tallest Himalayan mountain, but yeah, he did hike up K2, which I don't think he successfully made it to the top.
I heard different tales of it. I was
I have it in the slides.
Oh, perfect. I don't want to fast forward you.
It's
okay.
I didn't know
it's
a little later. Yeah,
that's
a little later in his life.
Okay, I'll totally wait. Go on.
So he meets this Julian Baker guy, and it's kind of interesting the way he meets Julian Baker. It seems like he knew that Julian Baker was a part of the Order of the Golden Dawn before he met him, right? Which suggests that Crowley was a spy sent to Switzerland to meet Baker and then be invited into the Order of the Golden Dawn, because he goes to this place where this guy was, and he makes this big impression on everybody as a guy who knows something about alchemy. But when he's giving his sort of public statements of like, yeah, another cool thing about alchemy, he's intentionally saying things incorrectly to get Baker's attention. So Baker then approaches him and says, hey, you were a little bit wrong about that alchemy. Let me give you a private lesson. He gains his confidence and then joins the Order of the Golden Dawn. So, obviously I'm not the guy to suggest that, but Richard Spence suggests that, this was something that he did as an intelligence agent. And it makes sense because very soon into his time in the Golden Dawn, he excels. He gets to a place where a lot of people are, kind of contempt. They have contempt for him. They're also kind of feeling like, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? And I did leave out that after Crowley's father passed away, he was left a whole bunch of money. He didn't inherit the money until he was old enough to get it at 18. But he had enough money to where he didn't need to work. He was completely able to, finance his mountaineering trips and be like a full-time Golden Dawn member, probably padded his way with some cash to get up the degrees faster, right? So he kind of greased the wheels, and I think that probably upset people. And he took a liking, or Mathers took a liking to him, and basically
Part of being the trust fund kid, though, I
Hmm.
feel like there's a lot of hate, all the hate that goes on Aleister Crowley. When I go on my contrarian, I'm like, okay, you end up with all the money in the world tomorrow. So many people out there listening to this or in the last few years have been on spiritual quests. If you had all the money in the world, maybe you would go meditate in the pyramids. Maybe you would go hike the mountain to sit at the top and do a ritual. Maybe you would pay to go sit in the coolest Russian building. It's like maybe that stuff too, like just a kid with money that it was also on some sort of spiritual
Oh
quest.
yeah.
Sometimes I think some of this stuff, wouldn't you do it too if you had the money?
Well, and there's certainly a case to be made that Crowley felt like he was a special person, someone who was meant to be doing these things. Like I said, he noticed that the year of his birth, these two very strange occult figures happened to be doing very important things. One of them dying, the other one creating their famous foundation. So yeah, Crowley definitely, I mean, he had like a lot of mobility. He had sincere interest in these things, but he also had, patriotic kind of aristocratic bent to him, right? And this is where the spycraft comes in because, although he, seems like a loose renegade later in his life, early in his life, he's very much someone who's like for king, queen, and country, like
Mm,
God, king, queen, and country. Like that's his thing. And he doesn't again, he doesn't totally dislike Christianity. He uses some of the things he's learned from his biblical lessons in his occult understanding, because the two are very
yeah.
similar in a way.
I've heard the spy thing as like one of the words getting thrown around Crowley. Never have I really like concentrated on it as the bent. Even bringing up the Jimmy Savile, it's interesting because if you just take away all what you just think Jimmy Savile is and you equate him exactly to Ghislaine Maxwell Epstein, and you're like, oh, or even Hugh Hefner, oh, this is a honey pot, or this is a honey trap, and this is just building blackmail, however that builds. And it,
Right.
whether the person starts out looking for the thing or if we can just get them drunk enough to put them in bed with the thing, the
Right.
blackmail happens either way. So looking at him with the same slant of just like spy, gathering intelligence, gathering, and also kind of infiltrating these magic orders, which we see every military and intelligence agency later on use all these kind of crazy techniques like you're talking about.
Yes.
Looking at it with just this angle, you could even be like, oh, Epstein, Savile, Crowley, these kind of, oh, they're all spies. They're just
Right.
levels of spies.
Well,
Even maybe they might not be practicing the magic as much as setting up other people for the blackmail.
right. And it's important to note that Crowley is not exclusively, you know, the sole spy occultist. There are other very famous occultists at this time who also did spy work. So you're very much on the right trail. And I'm so glad you're here to kind of jump back and forth with me on this, because that's a great point to make. And I think it's important in our modern context to understand that, guys like Crowley very much became an inspiration, obviously, even for guys like Ian Fleming, who was directly related to the CIA, created James Bond and based what's his name, some character, I forget the character's name, but he based a sort of pompous, bombastic evil villain off of Crowley. I forget the guy's last name, but he's a villain in one of the Bond films, and it's directly based on Crowley. So yeah,
and even the 007 isn't that something hook? Like, isn't the actual, like they say that symbol, the 007, it might be slick dissonant. I feel like they just have this quick, like, oh, 007, it's the blank, blank, blank. And it's like, if I think of it, I'll put it I'll edit it.
I mean, as far as I know, first of all, I'll say shout out to Slick Dissident. He has a whole other way of deciphering these things that I can't, comment on. But I'll say from like the mainstream sort of perspective, 007 is a nod to John Dee, who would use that code name or just way to sign certain things as 007. And also 7 is very symbolic, right? I mean, esoterically 7, you have 7 chakras, you have 7 senses to a certain extent, you have 7 sacred sites. I mean, there's something with the number 7.
Yeah.
But anyways, we have Crowley here kind of infiltrating the Order of the Golden Dawn, and it's at a time when there is a group of British folks who are sort of loyal to one strain of royalty, and they went by the Carlists. That was just sort of what we call them historically, and they were trying to get behind this guy Don Carl, who was one of the kings of Spain, to take over. And I think Spain had recently lost a major battle or war with England, so there were some people who were maybe legitimists towards that Spanish royal cause who were a part of the Order of the Golden Dawn. And this is very interesting to point out. I don't have that much information off the top of my head to talk about on this, but I will say that, Spain is a hotbed for occultism. You have to keep in mind, especially with the Tartarian conversation, the Tartars, the Barbars, the Moors, right? They invaded Spain, and a lot of the things that they brought from that Ottoman Empire, Islamic Enlightenment period into Spain and into the very, suppressed European consciousness, those things remained under the guise of secret society, Templar, this sort of thing. So, that royal family may have had, direct interest in groups like the Order of the Golden Dawn. I mean, I can't back that up, but I do think that, when we look at these royal families and their political orientations and then their, spiritual orientations, there's this like third factor of like the secret society fraternal connection that usually goes unnoticed. And it was extremely prevalent for people to be a part of orders like this back then. So to have Crowley again in this position wouldn't have been that strange for the time. But Crowley certainly was a strange guy who, unlike many other spies, wrote a great deal about what he was doing. Although he didn't really write much about his own spy craft, you can kind of imply it when you look at his records of where he traveled and what he was doing when he was there. And we're about to get into a little bit more of his travels, but
you could totally see why the royals would want it, though. I mean, look at the artifacts that they wear, the relics that they hold, the crowns, where the jewels are placed. I mean, even if anyone studies anything about stones of what we know them just metaphysically, or if they're into crystals or things like that, imagine what these stones and these things are bringing in. So even in the idea of Indiana Jones, I always bring up the trilogy Indiana Jones. They're in search of relics. It's not just Hitler that was looking for the Spear of Destiny, or, it's like they want the Ark of the Covenant. They want all these things, even if they were things before the Bible wrote about them. They want these things.
Oh yeah.
There's power in them. So I imagine, even spycraft wise, if there was a magical order, like if we were a witches in a coven and you heard rumor as the king that we could create gold out of wheat, you would come find us. And so I think in that kind of way, you would want to infiltrate every magic. Anyone that said they were doing anything, you would want to know if they could do it.
Right. Right. And, our country was founded by guys who were a part of these sorts of orders. The thing that I've been researching before I sort of stepped away briefly to look at Crowley is where I'm from, Connecticut, and how that fits into the founding of our country and some of the occult, esoteric things that have happened in the colonies that are not really mentioned. So maybe we'll have another conversation about that later on. But with Crowley, I think, yes, his generation was very much like in this world that was appropriate for the time. He wasn't like somebody who is in like these like back corners of like obscurity. I mean, there were groups like this present, moving, shaking, with, boasting memberships of other notable people. Crowley wouldn't have been a notable person at that time. He's really only become a notable person afterwards. His public reputation only got worse as he got more famous during his actual life, because he was a person against his time. I mean, he was into all this stuff that was traditionally kept a secret and kept amongst the lodge, amongst the sacred temple, and not, shared to the profane masses. So back to Crowley in London, and as the Golden Dawn sort of fragmented with his friendship with Mathers, Mathers told him to go back to the London Temple and take it over, which basically resulted in the guys like kicking Crowley out. They overpowered him, and then the court ruled in favor of them. Crowley and Mathers got sort of excommunicated from the Order of the Golden Dawn, and they effectively Crowley effectively infiltrated the Golden Dawn and kind of killed it in a way. It didn't really ever do anything much after that it, its time as an influential group had crested, right? It very much like it's only remembered for Crowley and what he's done with it, right? So he kind of took a lot of the things he learned from the Golden Dawn and put it into his future group that he called the Argentum or something like that. And some people say, it's supposed to mean like the age of Atlantis or something. So you kind of made me think of that when you said like the hidden technology and all that. Maybe we'll get into that further. But Crowley kind of travels around a lot after this time, and he goes to Mexico where he does peyote with some natives. And he also becomes a part of the Mexican Freemasons. He gets initiated into the Mexican Freemason group. And again, the Carlists, they were sort of against the British royalty, established royalty, in favor of Spain. So it makes sense that his next mission would be to go to Mexico and infiltrate this Freemasonry, because the British had a lot of interest in Mexican oil, and they were successful. Crowley potentially swayed the guys in the Freemason Lodge to be pro-British. And when it came time for the Mexican oil to be sold to certain prospects, the British companies won those prospects. So it's fair to say that while Crowley was doing peyote and learning about, maybe dark shamanism in the Mexico, he was also like doing kind of political espionage type of things, infiltrating these secret groups for political reasons. And I think that's fascinating because we don't typically blend those two things, at least when we look at them historically. We tend to think of like, oh, well, the theosophists and the spiritualists, they were interesting, but they were like hobbyists. They didn't have an impact on any on culture, which I think is wrong. A lot of very influential people were a part of these groups, and Crowley kind of proves that with his life and where he ended up. So he traveled a lot. He sailed from Mexico to from San Francisco to Hawaii. Walter Bosley writes about some time that he spent in San Bernardino, California. And I've never been there, but apparently there's some weird stuff that goes on in San Bernardino. There's a strange fault line, ley line going on over there. So if people want to learn about Crowley and his potential involvement in these unsolved crimes in San Bernardino, you should check out the Empire of the Wheel book by Walter Bosley. It's fascinating. I really think that book is worth reading. Doesn't go into Crowley too much, but it's interesting to think if he was involved in these unsolved crimes, what was he doing with the knowledge that he gained from the Order of the Golden Dawn and the Mexican Freemasons, and blending that with his spy craft. Bosley also talks about how back then in California, there were several different espionage groups. I was surprised to find out that there are people from the country of India, what was then called Hindustan, who were espionage agents in California doing all kinds of stuff. I had no idea. And it's just fascinating. But Crowley then goes to Paris and becomes a part of the art scene. He gets kind of used as a model for the character of Oliver Hotto in a novel called The Magician that would become kind of influential in the film scene. We have Crowley then meeting Rose, who would bear his first two children and work with him in the pyramid to summon this entity that Crowley called his guardian angel. So before we go there, though, I just wanted to point out Crowley has this quote that's I'm not going to read it because I don't want to repeat this, but folks can kind of read this if they're watching on the video. And for the listening audience, I'll just say it's a very derogatory paragraph about why women had no value to him other than to be sex objects. So whether that was because he was actually homosexual or because he was just a bigot, I don't know. But I think he had a very immature relationship with his sexual body. Like he clearly had no control. Someone who needs to have sex every 48 hours, even if that costs them, getting gonorrhea and syphilis and sleeping with prostitutes. But he meets this woman, Rose, and they kind of fall in love, even though it was a marriage of convenience, is how it was described by some of the people that were contemporary. And yeah, they off to honeymoon in Sri Lanka, which was then called Ceylon, to Paris, and they also went to Cairo, where they got into an apartment, set up a temple room, and began invoking ancient Egyptian deities while studying Islamic mysticism and Arabic. Rose, go ahead.
Oh, do you think at all could you put Aleister Crowley on a level of like a manly pee hole?
No, I think I'm really a little bit stunned that you asked that, because I was thinking about Manly P. Hall just the other day, and Manly P. Hall was a Freemason, but he was a honored Freemason, which means that he was given the title of Freemason after I think they realized, oh, this guy knows a great deal about us. So he's kind of a mysterious character. I don't know if I trust Manly P. Hall as as a accurate historian,
Hmm.
although he does write a lot about history, and it is fascinating to like get that take. I just have to question like whether or not the things he was writing about were given to him as truth by Freemasons for a certain purpose, as a sort of unwitting agenda, right? So, and no, Manly P. Hall, I don't know enough about him. I don't, have a biography of his. I have several of his books, but I have Crowley's biographies. So I feel like I have a better grasp on Crowley than I do on Manly. I like Manly P. Hall. I don't
Hmm.
think Manly P. Hall was someone who meant evil or harm or did evil or harm. I think the public or the Philosophical Research Society is kind of proof of this. Like they have like a very public, outwardly facing institution in his name. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's no writing from Manly saying like, oh, I did this blood ritual or had like, butt sex with this man. Like, I like they're totally different people, really.
Yeah,
But
I
I
don't know enough about Manly. I just have
equally
his book.
distrustful to a certain extent as far as like intrigue goes, because like Crowley, like the same can be said about him. He was taking this occult information, a lot of it that was not written in English at the time, and he was translating it. And, if he's the only authority on something that's never been translated in English, you have to ask yourself, like, did his espionage career influence that? Were there things that he was reporting back to his overseers that maybe didn't make its way into his writings, things that then the CIA and whatnot used to their advantage when creating programs like MK Ultra, right? Because those,
Hmm.
as you said, are very much occult. So, but it's interesting because Rose seems like someone who could qualify as like one of these MK Ultra candidates in a way. Um, we're told she was becoming delirious, and she informed Crowley that uh they are waiting for you, sort of ominously. And he had brought her to this museum and had her like, kind of shown all the exhibits, like which god talked to you, which god talked to you, like, and she pointed out um one piece, only one piece that she recognized, and it was the stele of Ankh Fn Khonsu. I said that like a Chinese word, but it's Egyptian. Uh,
I was impressed.
and Crowley thought it was important that the exhibit's number was 666, which of course connects to his moniker, the Beast, um, and that is the Stella of Revealing. So, yeah, it all kind of synced up for him. And as somebody who's experienced synchronicities myself, I've questioned like, at times, do I have a guardian angel? Do I have a higher spirit? And, it's important historically to think like, okay, maybe Crowley implanted that idea to some extent in the New Age community, this idea of like your guardian angel, because he was very much a believer in that after this Egypt experience. And, you know, personally, not knowing any of that up until very recently, and only knowing that, oh, I have a guardian angel, which came through pop culture. I mean, movies suggested that to me. It's not something I learned when I was raised like Catholic, or maybe it was introduced when I started reading this new age stuff. But throughout my own life, with my own personal experience, I can comment and say that the idea of having a guardian angel is not an evil idea. I think it's a very human idea. I think it's something that Crowley probably lifted from,
Or a
you
spirit guide.
yeah, I think it's something Crowley definitely like experienced to a certain extent and definitely wrote about, but I think he wrote about it in a way that was filtered through his ego because he wanted to be important. So his guardian angel was the most important guardian angel. So I don't think like Crowley's experience with guardian angels is necessarily something that we should use as a commentary for our own relationship with our own higher self. I like to use that term. It's kind of, I don't know, it does feel like a little clinical to like be like your higher self, you know? but I do feel like we have this like part of us, whether it's your dream self or whatever it is that is outside of your ordinary consciousness. And I think if you have the right discipline, that guardian can guide you and maybe even be beneficial source of contact. And you know, I think someone who's maybe more swayed by a different religion would say like, well, that's God, that is God, that's just God talking to you. But to a certain extent, we are a piece of God, we're a part of God, so maybe that's the in between. So I don't know, there's a variety of ways to think about that, and I'm not giving my sort of opine on which one's the best. I just think like when we look at Crowley, we have to like look at him not as somebody who was summoning a demon at this point in life, because for him at that point in life, it was still very much a benevolent thing that he was doing. He was bringing this book of the law into the world. It was dictated to him by this great Holy Spirit that he met in the temple, right? In the Great Pyramid Temple. And it's funny, I can't take credit for this joke, but I think you know Gordo from those conspiracy guys.
Yes, I love
They
him.
did they did a fantastic 6-hour episode on Aleister Crowley, and they made the joke during the episode that like he calls this being Iwas, right? And it's spelled like AAAIIAAWWAASSS. So it's spelled like the way you're supposed to pronounce it. And they have Irish accents, so I'm not going to impersonate them. But the joke was like that Crowley was saying, I was, like he was referring to himself and not even knowing that he was referring to himself, because his ego was so inflated that he heard the word I was and spelled it out as AIIW, instead of IWAS, referring to the I that is yourself, right? So
I
that
think this sometimes for a lot of words, even, and this is just a philosophy, everyone out there, but even like he's us, Jesus, like it's like these kind of simple ideas that even the everybody Balenciaga and Baal is king, but when you look up Baal, it usually means king or lord, so it's king is king, or into the Aleister Crowley, do as thy wilt, which that is just saying kind of like you're the most amount of sovereign. You don't abide by any other law except unto yourself.
That's the thing that, when you read Crowley and you read the people who have studied Crowley, yes, there are the occult apologists who want to just say, oh, Crowley's the best, and you can't interpret this as bad. I don't agree with them, and I'm not taking this point that I'm about to make from them. But Crowley, when he said, do as thou will, he didn't mean the will that is my own personal will that compels me to get up out of my chair and have a drink, or he was talking about the divine will that is like this overarching thing that people can connect to. It's not so much something that originates in any one individual. It's the collective will. It's what God, you can even say what God wants for humanity, right? That's kind of divine will in this term. So that phrase has been taken, it's been used by like creeps who call themselves Satanists to justify like doing whatever they want. And I think that's stupid. It's
So do
like,
you think the connection of Aleister Crowley, Anton LaVey, Aleister Crowley is because people usually connect them both together so quick.
well,
Do you think
yeah.
it's kind of unfounded altogether and they use
Oh,
that quote to kind of
I
build
think
off of?
Anton LaVey was certainly inspired by Aleister Crowley, but Aleister Crowley was long dead before Anton
Yeah.
LaVey was inspired by him. So, it's like the inventor of the gun. Like you can't blame that man for every death that's
Yeah.
since the gun, So, I hate to make that kind of like really obtuse comparison, but it does stand to logic that like you have to look at Crowley as a person who maybe got into something in a way that he wasn't prepared to deal with the consequences of. So, yeah, I think definitely people like LaVey took that and perverted it to a certain extent. I mean, there's a lot of hoopla about LaVey. I think he was certain like rebel in the sense that he wanted people to think he was like chopping the heads off of babies and goats, and like because it fulfilled this like sick fantasy that he had of how he wanted to be perceived. I think there's a certain like reality to that. But there are real crimes and there are real victims. And when we talk about real criminals and real victims, if those criminals are inspired by occult things, well, yeah, we can look at Crowley and say he is a source of that inspiration, but we also, have to look at,
Video
Christ.
games and Metallica.
Well, and the Bible too, because a lot
Yeah.
of people have been killed in the name of the Bible. A lot of people have been killed in the name of the Quran, and even I'm sure that the what's the Hebrew book, the Torah, right, or whatever their original book is, the Old Testament, right? Jesus was killed in the name of the Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
So, or in the name of money, right? So yeah, I think we have to like again like discard a little bit of that dualistic thinking when we look at any one individual, but then also like if we look at the body of intelligent material that Crowley put out, I mean, to call it intelligent is a sort of like grand compliment. If anything, like Crowley's like writing, it's very smart, but it's also coming from a certain madman, right? So like other madmen are going to take that madman's thoughts and be like, oh, okay, my madmanness is justified a little bit now, right? So I don't think Crowley was like totally the type to well, actually, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, he was definitely mad to a certain extent, and I don't know how much he actually acted on that, but he definitely was abusive to like the people that chose to be around him, which is interesting because he had that hypnotism to keep them around. And I think that's something that a lot of cult leaders have. So he does play into those archetypes, but he's also not, he's not like this infallible god that people want to make him out to be when they say like, oh, he's the root of all Satanism, right? Because then you're
Yeah.
saying, then you're giving him way more credit than he deserves, because to a certain extent he didn't really understand a lot of what he was writing. And I think that that was a part of it for him, because he wanted to give off this persona of like, oh yes, I am the wickedest man in the world, because that was a part of the mesmerism, that was a part of the hypnotism that compelled people like Victor Neuberg to be his unwitting, pet, basically, who would just go along with any ritual that Crowley needed to do, even if that meant, sadistically abusing the poor guy. He was paying Crowley to be there, which is, kind of sickening to think about that. He was paying for this abuse, but in his mind it wasn't abuse because he was a part of this magical working, right? And again, like the same argument is made when people in like the kink community, like they do things in private that they wouldn't want people seeing, because people would say, oh, you're hurting that person, you're abusing that person. But then they say, no, I volunteered to be tied up, I volunteered to be
I
whipped.
wanted a horsetail butt plug.
Right. So you have to like you can't put that assignment of, intention totally there. But then again, when we look at things from the cultural perspective, you and I would both agree that BDSM is not a healthy expression of sexuality. Although maybe there's consensual participants who get something out of it, I think that's a byproduct of our sickened society. And I think Crowley is somebody that very traditional religious people equate with the collapse of traditional values in the direction of a moral compromise, and maybe even an embracement of certain depravities, right? But then again, as a lesbian yourself, like you wouldn't agree that homosexuality is depraved, right? So I think we have to be and I wouldn't either, right? So
But
I
that's
think
kind
that,
of one of the schlick things that I think that the rulers of society do is they take a couple normal things and they
right,
mix it in with perversity
right,
so that way they can control. And
right,
so then once we have control of our politicians or our bankers or our media people, it's all that same blackmail, honey. It's like if once I can find out your kink, then I can control you with it, especially if I already took a picture of you once.
right. Well, and also, like, not to equate your personal life to what we're talking about. I want to separate what I'm about to say from what I just said, because I think the BDSM stuff, to a certain extent, is unhealthy, an unhealthy expression of sexuality, whether straight or gay. And I think that, what we see with the SRA stuff, I mean, you can call BDSM SRA light to a certain extent, right? I mean, it's SRA up into the point of
They
actually
with BDSM and SRA, what do those mean?
bondage, sadomasochism, I think, is BDSM. Or I don't know what the D in BDSM stands for. And then SRA is satanic ritual abuse. So, I mean, again, I'm probably making some people in the audience very uncomfortable if they're, interested in that particular kink. And I apologize. Again, I'm not trying to say that consenting adults, shouldn't be able to do what they want with each other. But I think that, like, some of those, torture like methodologies,
Even
uh,
things that aren't torturous. I mean, I talk to my audience all the time. I think a lot of the things that people, it's perfectly, you're allowed to do whatever you want if you're turned on by feet, but you're turned on by feet because probably you were in a bathroom stall at too old of an age or in a ladies' changing room. Or if you're a cuck, if you're turned on by that idea of cucking, it's probably because you've watched so much porn that you've watched the money shot of another man's penis so many times. That's the only way you can get turned on by a vagina now. So it's like every level of kink. It's like it isn't healthy. And it doesn't matter if we're allowed to do it or not. We should also, as adults, be able to look at each other and say, this thing I do is weird. And it's probably from some kind of trauma, or even if we don't consider it traumatic that your mom took you in a bathroom too old while you, and we say starting puberty, and people are like, I wasn't starting puberty until blank. And I'm like, well, puberty is a cycle that's very long. And so when you start getting boners and feeling different ways about yourself as a kid, and you're sitting in a ladies' changing room, it's just doing weird thoughts to it's weird wiring. So I think it might not be a traumatic moment, but now you have all these questions and stuff running through your brain, and maybe shame for the first time, and maybe all these, it's like, and you're not allowed to say anything about it. So it becomes the kink as it grows and grows and grows in your, so I don't, what's healthy and unhealthy, I don't really know, but there are so many things in our society right now, because we've been slowly abused. Our parents were abused, and we've all been kind of brainwashed in this way to all work through our root chakra. So everything is kind of this kink, like it's leaning toward this way. Like I do talk to my audience about this stuff all the time.
yeah.
So
Well,
yeah,
and
I
again,
think that I can see what you're saying too. The same way everyone can say all porn is gay porn, and all porn is eventually, even if it's consensual adults, porn sites will eventually harm children. Like even if the porn site doesn't practice in that, the whole system that works, you're contributing to something that also does this thing.
right.
So it's like, does all sexual depravity, you're not practicing Satanism, but you might be leaning into a ritual that you don't know anything about. You might be separating yourself like this from yourself in a way that who's there when you walk away, the same way as being like blackout drunk. Like you're inviting entities and energies that you aren't necessarily aware of, even if you just think you're getting turned on through your root chakra. But that's just my personal opinion on it. I won't put it all on you. But
No, yeah, and I don't have any, qualms with what people do, again, with consenting adults, but there is that traditional religious perspective that equates that shift in culture to people like Crowley and the movement that he was, for lack of a better word, either a part of, the founding, or just swept up into through maybe the intelligent agencies. I mean, I think that is one theory that, it's not substantiated by the authors I mentioned before, but it's something that I kind of am suspicious of, is like these culture creators and how they use people like him to get people thinking from their root chakra rather than their crown chakra, and again, I'm not some, perfect person who wants to tell everyone, oh, you got to be perfect just like me. But I do think that, like, what you said there, which was very helpful to kind of clearing the air on some of the more, touchy subjects here. I think it's important to mention that there are real victims of things like SRA, and there are real victims of crimes, and the fact that there's kind of an overlap with occult practices, and then there's another overlap with like kink community things. I don't think that means there's a direct like linear correlation, but it's evident that something's changing, right? And
Well,
maybe
it's the same way as like me getting married has nothing to do with a drag queen reading to kids in a library, but
right.
somewhere it's all a thing now. But that's kind of what they wanted it to be. It's like all packaged together and then like me and my wife making cookies on a Sunday has nothing to do with some guy in a G-string walking down the street leading a parade in front of your kids,
Right.
but somehow it's all the same thing now.
Well,
Like
and
this is like that was the goal.
that's what they want to do. And in the same way, Crowley kind of became that for all occultism, where, oh, Crowley did this, therefore everything's bad. Lon Milo Duquette, he's bad. Damien Eccles, he's bad. Like, and I personally think Damien Eccles is pretty bad, but that's a
Me
different
too.
conversation. But yeah, so Crowley, he kind of, again, we have to look at him for the person he was. And here's a incident where, we see that he wasn't the best person. And he, like you asked before, did he climb up the Himalayas? Well, he climbed up Kachenjunga in Nepal. And at that time, the British had an interest in Nepal. They actually invaded Nepal around that time. The Russians were in Nepal. Very, very interesting time period, a very interesting place. And Crowley was there, not just for mountaineering, but possibly for spy reasons. And apparently, he was such a kind of asshole on this expedition that the rest of the crew tried to mutiny against him, and it ended up killing all of them. I think he was like one or two of the only people that survived that expedition, and the people that did survive blamed him, and he kind of had a really bad reputation as a mountaineer ever since that point. So, I don't know what that says about Crowley kind of putting his own maybe objectives over the lives of other people. Obviously wants to get to the top of this mountain to have some kind of spiritual experience, and yeah, he was not successful. So
Didn't some people say that he did a spell up there or a ritual and caused an avalanche?
yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. It's like, how would we prove that?
There's one side. And I'll ask you the other side too, to bring it back to the spy thing of it.
Yeah.
In a like way of that, we know spies work, and we take certain few people on this mission, and only me and one other dude come back from this mission that there happened to be an avalanche on. I'm going to go right up there and do a quick ritual. By a ritual, I mean I'm going to stick a bomb in the side of this mountain and blow an avalanche on all these people, and I'm going to know where to stand to survive it. And you're like, you listed people that died in it that were actually famous enough to have their name listed. So then it's like, did we kill these people on purpose? Or was this like a Clinton suicide back when? Like, was he maybe a higher level spy doing where it's like, yeah, sure, go on the Titanic. I'll meet you there. And I'm JP Morgan. And then I, like a week before I go, I'm like, I'm not going to make the ship.
You're onto something there. We'll get to that later. But yeah, don't let me forget about the Titanic. Yeah, I don't, again, I don't discount that. I don't leave that as being impossible. No, I think that's very likely that he had some ulterior motive. Again, like they were in Nepal not just to climb mountains, but because it was politically active at the time. It was a very important place to have control over, and especially considering what would happen in the next 100 years with Russia and China and England, right? So yeah, definitely I'm not versed enough in that
But what
history.
a perfect cover story. That crazy guy did a spell up there. Don't go on a mountain trek
Well,
with
and
him.
that's the trouble with Crowley, is like you have to be careful, because there are a lot of conspiracy authors who have written things about him that just aren't true, unfortunately, as interesting and as legendary as they might be, and they do add to his sinister image. I don't want to be the guy to pass on the wrong information. I mean, if we're talking about like the
I
best
love this stance about you.
movie,
Anyone who's into anything, if you want always this stance that is like you're just going to give the facts and it's not ever going to get off the what if this means this and what if this means this and what if this, it's not a ton of mental masturbation.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if we were writing like the best Crowley movie, yes, we would include that, and that would be probably a cool plot point. But no, I don't know enough about him to be able to say like for sure he did that. And he went on in this trip to do some things that definitely affected the rest of his life. Obviously, kind of keeping his relationship with his holy guardian angel, but he traveled through with his wife and newly born child, which I think says a lot about him as an individual and as a father, that he would bring his kid along with him. But I mean, it was a different time. Um, and yeah, so they traveled through China, and he was smoking all this opium, and this was right around like the Opium War time. So Britain definitely had an interest in China's opium, and he traveled through a lot of what would later be known as Vietnam. Then it was called, French something or other. But yeah, he was traveling on horseback through China. He actually shot some people in India prior to his trip in China, non-lethally shot them. But yeah,
And isn't the Opium Wars like one of the big, huge guys that created the Opium Wars? His cousin was like the creator of the Skull and Bones.
well, yeah, a lot of the Russell Trust Association, which incorporated the Skull and Bones into becoming like what it is, that name Russell, that's named after William Huntington Russell, whose cousin was Samuel Russell, who is a uh, mercantile, sort of very wealthy kind of shipping guy, and all of those guys in the New England coast were selling opium because they had recently lost their money in slavery. They couldn't do the slave trade as much anymore. They were still doing the slave trade, they just couldn't do it publicly. So now they had to find something else. So yeah, they were into opium for sure. Yeah,
And they got all of China kind of addicted to it to control them. They always said that would be the way to control a whole country.
well, and that was, that was after somewhat. Yeah, it's interesting. Crowley being in there was after that period, because
Okay.
Skull and Bones is, was around before Crowley was born. But yeah, definitely something that the British were nonetheless invested in when
Thinking about him as a spy is blowing my mind. Like thinking about it with that whole new goggles on is like, oh my gosh. And what was happening at this part of the world now? And what's happening here? And now you can just move this guy anywhere. And
Well, I think that's part of why he has the reputation as this big bad black magician, because the British government doesn't want the attention focused on this stuff. They don't want him seeming like a competent agent. They want him seeming like a bumbling black magician who's just wicked and evil and not to be looked at, right?
it's the Monica Lewinsky, where don't look at Epstein Island. We'll put a scandal out of our own.
Right.
So it's kind of like that's what they do to him. Don't look any deeper here. We'll put all this stuff, all this smoke screen that's so creepy and weird to look at. You'll never get to back here that he's just a spy for British intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah. And he ended up, spending some time in Yunnan, China, and then headed to Shanghai to meet a woman who he had an affair with after he shipped his wife and newly born kid off to back to England, I think, or maybe like Calcutta, India. So he sends his wife and kid off, has this affair in China, goes off to Japan, then Canada, then New York City, and then finds out that his daughter had died. Oh no, my Crowley the Father image is not here. You can't see him. There's a delightful picture of him and his daughter and his and Rose. And I don't know. I mean, maybe you can see it. I can't see it.
I can't see it either.
Oh shoot. Okay.
Maybe I'll lay it on there and edit.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. But anyway, so yeah, Rose was born, and shortly after that trip to China, she died. I think the slides might be out of order, but yeah, around the same time, Crowley was writing another pornographic poetry book called Snowdrop. So initially he had White Stains, and he had Snowdrops, and Snowdrops also has some uh, pedophilic pornographic poetry in it, which is odd. But also, I mean, again, maybe a byproduct of the time, maybe something that was a little more accepted within British culture, and not something that he completely invented or was particular to him, right? But it's still nonetheless
And
shocking.
it's not like a rabbit hole you really want to go down of pedophilia, pornography
Well, and
around
it's not
famous
even,
people in Britain at the time.
but it's not even that. I mean, it's not like, I don't think other people have gone down it. So I couldn't. Like, I mean, I don't have the skills to like do the research that's required to look into that enough. Like, I'm kind of resting on the shoulders of people who have, that capacity to look through Crowley's life, but maybe didn't decide to go down that avenue themselves. And again, like those guys I mentioned earlier, Philip Fairbanks or John Cerrucci, they have written about that subject, and I'd have to go and look at their work to see if there's any crossover. But as far as right now, no, I think it was just more of a cultural thing that he picked up on, maybe something that was more a part of the underbelly of London for longer than just Jimmy Savile, right? So
Yeah.
anyways, Crowley arrives in Britain, finds out his daughter had died while he was off, and he sent his wife to just kind of fend for herself and take care of the daughter, and that led to Rose becoming an alcoholic, which Crowley was not really sympathetic towards her for that. And he kind of just like shooed her off. They did have a second child who I don't think passed away. I think she actually lived and outlived both her father and her mother. So there is a Crowley child out there. A lot of people try to say that like Barbara Bush might be, a relative of Crowley, and considering that, this daughter, I don't know if he had any other children. It's totally possible that he did, but if his daughter was around, she definitely wouldn't have had the last name Crowley after she had a child. So, I don't know, maybe there's a different name that person went by, and we can find a connection there. But yeah, Crowley had, oh no, it looks like all my pictures are broken now. What's going on? Maybe I need to reload my slides.
Take your time.
Oh.
Well, why if you're doing that, if I don't know how much of your brain power, I'll ask you about Scotland.
Yeah.
With Aleister Crowley, because that was before all this stuff, right?
So sort of within the same time, because he's traveling a lot, and he goes back to Scotland a couple times. And yeah, he had this house called the Boleskine House in Scotland on Loch Ness, and he was doing some ritual workings there, the Merlin ritual that was sort of lengthy and exhaustive. He did some of it there and did not continue with his work. And some people think that the fact that he kind of like stopped the ritual midway and gave up on it, like left a magical energy in that house to this day. And the third episode of my podcast, I talked to a guy from Ireland who I guess is been to Scotland a couple times. Maybe he's from Scotland. I mean, shoot, I really hope I don't know the difference between an Irish person and a Scottish person, but I do. Maybe I'm just forgetting. But either way, he had some kind of like connection to the Boleskine house, and he told me about how it was burned down twice. One, the first time mysteriously, the second time I think they chalked it up to like vandals. And he also told me about this box that he found. This is a guy who's alive now. He found a box in the Boleskine house, or he bought a box that was found in the Boleskine house, and it had not been opened. And he opened it after we had planned on doing our podcast, and he told me about what was in the box during the podcast. And it was like a creepy voodoo doll, and something that was allegedly written by Crowley himself. A lot of people like to point at his most famous entity that he encountered, which is Lamb. And Lamb kind of looks like a gray alien. It's got like this big inflated forehead. It doesn't have the eyes that we have, with grays. People typically see like more insectoid style eyes on a gray, or maybe even like big black eyes. This drawing had just sort of normal looking, European style eyes. So yeah, there's some strange things with Crowley that have like left a residue there in that Boleskine house to this day. And obviously Loch Ness has the Loch Ness monster. So and it's a very deep lake, which magically that's important. If you're doing ritual working, you want to have, sort of you want to have a body of water nearby, and that helps. You're muted.
There are people that theorize that he left some magical portal open, and that maybe it was what the Loch Ness energy was or is, like some other entity from a different. I always go back to Alex Jones on Joe Rogan being like the interdimensional space demons, and somewhere in like an easy way, they opened up an interdimensional portal of some sort with their magic. And in the same way, if we were just to talk about the avalanche in a magical way, could you theorize that maybe the Loch Ness monster isn't a dinosaur of thinking, but maybe just an energy that came out of the water from magic, like an egregore or a servitor?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't discount that. And Crowley traveled a lot in America, so who knows, maybe he had some encounters here too, like with Bigfoot or one of the other strange creatures that we have all around the United States.
All
right, so you should be able to see the screen. So as we were saying before, there's some sort of there's a bunch of theories about people who may or may not be related to Crowley, but as far as I know, he only had daughters, and his daughters, a few of them passed away. So I don't know. I mean, he did get around a lot, so he could have some illegitimate children that we don't know about. But I think a lot of those claims of lineage to Crowley are either by people who wish they had something to connect them to Crowley, or maybe by researchers who want someone to be associated with his sinister, persona, which may or may not be built on truth. I mean, he was a mystic, which to anyone who's of a sort of traditional bent, mysticism could seem like Satanism or worse. So I don't know. I think that Crowley definitely had some things in common with me. I love smoking weed, and he wrote a whole book about the psychology of hashish, where he made heavy use of his pipe and hash. And he was traveling all over the place, so I'm sure he got a variety of different hashes from different places, and he said that it aided in his mysticism, and I would concur that that is what happened to me.
I
It's
was just about to ask you if it aided in your mysticism.
Yeah, and I think, it's also why I became interested in Crowley in the first place, was because when I started smoking weed, I felt like there was a truth out there that I had yet to hear of in my normal life that maybe can't. And I started to notice my intuition guide me towards certain books. And I remember getting Crowley's Book of the Law, which was basically the book that he recited in the Egyptian pyramid. And I was really disappointed. I mean, it read more like, scripture than anything else I'd ever, it's just like a guy that was like saying, "Oh, the world's going to change and here's why." So, but some of his books are worth reading. This one I have in my hand, the Book of Lies, actually has more truth in it than most of his books, in my opinion. And I've learned a couple really interesting things about him. And it's actually this book that got him involved with the OTO, because the OTO was not founded by Crowley, contrary to what people want to say about Crowley. Crowley founded something different called the AA, and he was writing all these holy books, things like with titles like Liber Arcanorum or Liber Porta Lucis Sub Figura. I mean, he was writing a bunch of what we could call ceremonial magic, and this kind of laid the groundwork for what would later become his Thelema religion, which is definitely, it makes sense that he would become this kind of prophet. He came from a family of people who believed, the Plymouth Brethren, who believed in this sort of like going from town to town and preaching the good word. So, the archetype of the prophet was always kind of in the background of his mind throughout his life, and he kind of had the wealth and the finances to support this interest in spirituality. So he's called kind of a hack in a certain way, because a lot of what he wrote isn't his own. He's translating a lot of stuff. But to a certain extent, that is like a very valuable thing to do at that time, because a lot of that stuff hadn't been written in English, especially written in like plain English. So, yeah, I think there's, again, another kind of aspect to Crowley where he's not all bad. He's more of a kind of like a trickster figure in a way, revealing things while also having a harmful edge. Um, but I think that harmful edge was really a byproduct of his trauma and his weird associations. But anyways, his inheritance was running out by 1909, and he was hired by a guy to help protect him from witchcraft. This guy thought that he was being assailed by witches, so he hired Crowley, and Crowley became friends with him and sort of brought him along with him to Morocco to get over his fears of witchcraft. And then sometime after that, he meets this guy, Jones. I think I have his full name here. Yeah, Jones Fuller. And they start the AA, which was like pretty much, the same thing as the Golden Dawn, but with all of Crowley's new Thelema type, writings infused into it. So he wanted to make it like a successor to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
And the AA is so similar to the Hermetic triangles of as above, so below, that you see just those very air, water symbols, depending on what part of the earth you're looking at. It's clever to me just staring at it right now. And the Hermetic symbol of even how it looks almost Star of David-y, but it's still the a thelema symbol. It's almost Star of David, but it's the as above, so below as well. And so he did think with his sigil magic. Like he was putting so much thought into everything that he did. It nothing was flippant for him.
Yeah, it definitely, as a ceremonial magician, you could say that. I mean, there's definitely things that he wrote that make no sense. So, I mean, you can't say that
Oh my gosh.
about Crowley.
777. It's like my brain has such a hard time of getting into a place of being, I don't know, anywhere to even. It's just such a hard book to read to me.
Well, on the point of his writing, he actually wrote a few articles for Vanity Fair. Um, I don't know if this, I think I just picked a random cover of Vanity Fair. I don't think this is the exact issue that contained his article, but I thought it was cool that they had the Masonic checkerboard on their Vanity Fair cover. Who knows what that has to do with?
The
Uh,
roses, the Joker. I thought
right.
tons of great symbology.
Right. So, like I said, Crowley, he's smoking hash. He's going to Morocco. He meets this guy, Victor Neuberg, who becomes like a student protege, but also sort of like an assistant in these magical rituals and also a sex partner in these magical rituals. So he takes Victor down to Algeria. Again, another place that's like a political front at the time where maybe he's doing some side spy work. But he goes and does this now it's sort of one of the more famous things that he's done, which is the evocation of a demon named Choronzon. And this involves some sort of bloodshed. Where I'm not sure. It might be written out there somewhere. Exactly whose blood was shed, whether that was an animal or their own blood or whatever. I mean, neither of them died. Who knows what came along with that type of ritual? But this this was a part of this like turn, like this ritual. He begins to do more public ritual work after this mountaintop sex magic ritual, invoking a demon, right? So I don't know enough about like the inner workings of like the occult stuff to give you like the two like sides of this ritual. Like some people are going to hear this and be like, oh, that's all bad. Of course he was evoking a demon with blood sacrifice. Like that's terrible. But then there's other people who are going to make the argument that, oh, well, this is ceremonial. They use some sort of stand-in for a sacrifice. A lot of people have pointed out a passage in Crowley's very big book, which I own, called Liber
It could
Magic.
be menstrual blood. There's
Right.
blood magic and all sorts of things that has nothing to do with killing. Just to, add to that
Well, and
point that it's like sometimes it's not nefarious.
exactly. And, that's again, I don't know enough about the inner workings of these ceremonies to say what exactly goes down physically. There's obviously there's a discrepancy between like what they're doing in the physical world and what they're doing maybe in the imaginal world, in the realm of their mind, in a dream state. I mean, you have to imagine that during a ceremonial magic, they're going into some sort of trance. So to read the contents of like, let's say, a ceremonial magic session and take it verbatim as like physical fact, I think is not really appropriate for the subject matter. I think it's something that takes part halfway in the mind and halfway in the real world. So, but anyways, everybody who wants to point the finger at Crowley and call him a villain points out the part of his book that I have here, where he suggests that the most suitable sacrifice victim is a young man of sufficient like naivete and innocence, right? So, this implies like that there's some sort of really really evil thing going on here where maybe he actually has killed a child in the name of ritual sacrifice. I mean, it's certainly not elaborated on much in this book. It just they
It's
mention
not unheard of in the
and it's
world
not
we're
unheard
in.
of. It's not unheard of. And also there are the Crowley apologists who would tell you that no, that's just a metaphor for masturbation, right? Because semen is considered like children, right? But I don't know how much they knew about the,
In a real simple way, like Paranoid American and I were talking about it, and I just like this way of thinking about everything too, of being like this grunting naked ape. So, like a human sacrifice, we would be like crying like rain. We need to make human cry to make God happy to make rain. And so, like, they would have this very grunting way that maybe as we got more philosophical and more enlightened and all these things, we would have thought these really barbaric rituals were for some higher thing, but really it was just how they thought it was to make it rain back when. And so, in a way of blood, it's like if you put blood on any soil, what happens to it? I don't know. Does it add minerals for growth for crops later on that you wouldn't necessarily understand in a grunting ape kind of way? That a crop might have found value or a tribe might have found value with it. So they did it again the next year. They were like, whoa, we cut our goat's neck here last year, and this corn was so much bigger than our last corn. Maybe we should cut a goat's neck here every year. Like sometimes things that we think of in such a gross, nefarious way because of where we're at now, we didn't come from those places intellectually to understand the like same way that a fair chicken, they just rinse repeat. They don't know. They're like, oh, if I touch this center point, I get fed. So they're like, look at this chicken knows what purple is. But no, it just knows how it's going to get fed. Kind of idea that
right.
sometimes it's like we think everything's sometimes so dark ritual, but maybe it's just a smarter person looking at a dumb person repeat something and think something comes out of it different.
Yeah, no, there's certainly nuance to a lot of this stuff. I think that's the trouble with some of the less academic takes on this stuff. And then that's the trouble with conspiracy, is that you can't really trust the establishment, to be honest. So who do we trust with things like this, and how do we assess history in this way? But when it comes to blood sacrifice, yeah, there's a lot of interpretations. I just want to read verbatim instead of paraphrasing exactly what he says, because it's a specific chapter of this book. It's chapter 7, page 204, titled "Of the Bloody Sacrifice." And he says, it is necessary for us to consider carefully the problems connected with the bloody sacrifice, for this question is indeed traditionally important in magic. Nigh all ancient magic revolves around this matter. In particular, all the Osirian religions, the rites of the dying god, refer to this. The slaying of Osiris and Adonis, the mutilation of Attis, the cults of Mexico and Peru, the story of Hercules or Melkarth, the legends of Dionysus or Mithra are all connected with this one idea. In the Hebrew religion, we find the same thing inculcated. The first ethical lesson in the Bible is that only the sacrifice pleasing to the Lord is the sacrifice of blood. Abel, who made this, finding favor with the Lord, while Cain, who offered cabbages, was rather naturally considered a cheap sport. The idea recurs again and again. We have the sacrifice of the Passovers, following on the story of Abraham's being commanded to sacrifice his firstborn son, with the idea of the substitution of animal for human life. The annual ceremony of the 2 goats carries out this in perpetuity. And we see again the domination of this idea in the romance of Esther, where Haman and Mordecai are the 2 goats or gods, and ultimately in the presentation of the rite of Purim in Palestine, where Jesus and Barabbas happened to be the goats in that particular year, of which we hear so much without agreement on the date. Enough has now been said to show that the bloody sacrifice has from time immemorial been the most considered part of magic. The ethics of the thing appeared to have concerned no one, nor, to tell the truth, need they do so. As St. Paul says, without shedding of blood there is no remission. And who are we to argue with St. Paul? But after all, that it is open to anyone to have any opinion that he likes upon the subject or any other subject, thank God. At the same time, it is most necessary to study the business, whatever we may be going to do about it, for our ethics themselves will naturally depend upon our theory of the universe. So, I mean, here you see Crowley has a sense of humor about this. He's telling you, this is not something that I'm inventing. It's clearly a part of every culture's, high society religion to sacrifice with blood. I mean, he even points at Jesus Christ himself being a blood sacrifice. So he takes it very seriously. And he has some ethics about it too. I mean, he's suggesting that people's ethics depend on their theory of the universe, which at the time I'm sure may be referring to like Darwinism and this idea that, oh, we're just accidents of evolutionary coincidences, apes in a faraway material ball, this is that atheistic thing that's coming around at the time. And Crowley clearly was not an atheist at all. So he would have had some probably poor things to say about atheists. But if we were quite certain, for example, that everybody went to heaven when he died, there could be no serious objection to murder or suicide, as it is generally conceded by those who know neither that earth is not such a pleasant place as heaven. However, this is a mystery concealed in this theory of the bloody sacrifice, which is of great importance to the student, and we therefore make no further apology. We should not have to make even this apology, for an apology, had it not been for the solicitude of a pious young friend of great austerity of character, who insisted that the part of this chapter which now follows, the part which was originally written, might cause us to be misunderstood. This must not be. So, I mean, this is kind of hard to decipher. I don't know what your thoughts are on it. I can tell you how I interpret it. He's basically saying, hey, we're going to talk about bloody sacrifice, and I didn't invent it, so don't blame me. I'm not the source of it, right? Which is interesting because the Crowley apologists want to tell you that it's just an allegory, it's just a metaphor. But if it's just an allegory and it's just a metaphor, well, was Jesus's, hanging on the his crucifixion, was that just an allegory? Was that just a metaphor? I mean, to some people's universe worldview, yeah, sure. I mean, there's plenty of people. You go around and poll people on the street and ask them if they thought Jesus was actually a living person. I'm sure now in the modern day, people will probably say no. They'll say, oh, no, he's just a myth. He's just an invention of Christian religion, which I don't personally subscribe to that. I tend to think that he was a physical living person, but either way, it's definitely, interesting to have this like qualification to the beginning of the sacrifice chapter, and Crowley even kind of being a little bit like frustrated about having to give an apology, almost like insulted that he need to explain himself to, the unadept. So yeah,
if you were going to talk about magic in any way, if you were to give to any god, and you were to even probably read about it in the Bible, to sacrifice to a god would be one thing. Even to give it, people that work in any sent that they might leave a Snickers bar for a certain deity. So if you could give it, if you were requested to give it blood, or if you felt like we gave the sun god this, and then like you're saying, okay, well, we'll just give it all our old people. No, the gods know that's kind of cheating. So the younger we give it, it knows how valuable this baby is to us. So that would be one thing. And even back when, if we had a son, that would be way, way, way more valuable than a daughter. Look how helpful of a hand that's going to be for the farm and for taking care of things later on. It's not going to be two mouths to feed. It's not a womb to worry about. So to sacrifice that would be the most valuable thing back when, to if we believed in a higher power. So the blood of the thing would be real. And we can see this blood sacrifice just in, you know, the bull dance we were talking about, the running of the bulls all the way down to like the matadors, and how this is like a representation throughout so much of history. This isn't just he didn't create it, not to stick up for Crowley, but I would imagine if you were practicing in such high levels of magic that you were doing sex rituals past a point of your own sexuality, you might be doing blood rituals past a point of your own moral code as well. So it might not be.
Well, and I didn't even get to the most salacious part. He says it would be unwise to condemn as irrational the practices of those savages who tear the heart and liver from an adversary and devour them while yet warm. In any case, it was the theory of the ancient magicians that any living being is a storehouse of energy, varying in quantity according to the size and health of the animal, and in quality according to its mental and moral character. He then goes on to give an example of something and then says, for the highest spiritual working, one must accordingly choose that victim which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim. And that, you know, it's shocking to hear that, but he kind of like annotates those two sentences and says, it appears from the magical records of, well, actually, these are the editors saying this. It appears from the magical records of Frater Perdurabo, which is Aleister Crowley's sort of fraternity name, that he made this particular sacrifice on average about 150 times every year between 1912 and 1928. Consider or contrast J.K. Huseman's Laba, where a perverted form of magic of an analogous order is described. And this is a quote from that J.K. Huseman's Labas that they're comparing to Aleister Crowley's statement. For context, it says, it is the sacrifice of oneself's spirituality. I'm sorry. This is let me try to rephrase this. It is the sacrifice of oneself spiritually, and the intelligence and innocence of that male child are the perfect understanding of the magician, his one aim without lust of result. And male he must be, because what he sacrifices is not the material blood, but his creative power. This initiated interpretation of the text was sent spontaneously by somebody with a acronym for a name, IWE, for the sake of the younger brethren. And then they say, although Crowley intersperses cautions against literal interpretations of his remarks throughout the chapter, his detractors frequently cite this statement out of context to assert that he advocated literal human sacrifice, a practice he repudiated. So what they're basically saying is that Crowley's not talking about killing a man, killing a male child. he's talking about masturbation, and that's why he was able to do that 150 times every year between the years 1912 and 1928, not because he had a serial killing spree, but because he was a serial masturbator. And I mean, that's probably very common considering the sexual atmosphere we're in today. People are watching porn and masturbating daily. So to say that he only did it every other day instead of every day is kind of like, I don't know, makes him less of a sexual person than some people. At least me, when I was at the height of my single young male life. So yeah, I mean, that being said, it's hard to separate Crowley from the vision we get of him in the conspiracy world. Like I said, there are real criminals, there are real victims. So the human mind wants to put it in a story context. We want to have a bad guy to point to. And because the system, more often than not, is protecting these awful criminals, it's hard to reconcile how that kind of thing would happen. And I don't know. I'm not an expert, but I don't think Crowley intended on being an influence on that. Whether or not he was, I think, is without debate. He certainly was. People of all types of depravity have taken his work and used it to inspire them going further with it. But that isn't necessarily his fault. So I mean, again, you write that kind of stuff. Yes, it's irresponsible to a certain extent because he knew maybe people would interpret it as a actual killing rather than just simply masturbating. So yeah, I don't know. It's definitely like all of the stuff about Crowley being evil, in my opinion, as far as I've found, it kind of all goes back to that, what I just read.
There is masturbation is a thing in sex magic. Semen is a whole separate thing in sex magic. Blood is a whole separate thing in sex magic. Murder, it would be a whole separate, like, I mean, the idea of what it could be in between, it could be anything. And then it could be all the things. And then it also could be kind of in a way of making the lore of him darker, or the just in case later on, if there actually was bodies found, that in the Jimmy Savile way, that everything that we've found out about him afterward, or everything that unfolds about these people after their death, it's like, who kind of knows? It almost seems like they let him have too much of his lore, where you don't know if it's like part of it's a shaming ritual or part of it, like the amount we know about this guy still in our zeitgeist is pretty interesting that they've allowed so much of it to stay.
I think Crowley, he's definitely one of the more documented people of his time. He wrote a lot about himself and other people wrote a lot about him. He had a lot of contemporaries that were writers. So yeah, there's a lot to find about him. But I don't think Crowley had the same power, sway, and influence that a guy like Savile had. I mean, Savile, you're talking about somebody who was literally like friends with the royal family, right? I mean, he was Britain's like #1 pop star. Crowley was more of like a punk rocker before they had punk rock. I mean, he was kind of punk rocking against the Christian traditional stuff while still kind of being a conservative person himself. Like I said, he wasn't like a liberal in the sense that we would have today or even in the 60s. I mean, he probably would have thought the hippies were like kind of,
trash.
rugged and not really like worth his time. So yeah, I mean, although those folks got a lot of inspiration from him and kind of like Jimmy Page, like took a lot of musical inspiration from his occult stuff. Like I think that would have happened with or without him, but it wouldn't have happened as quickly. Like he definitely like opened up a lot of those occult things to be more palatable for people who were
He pop
uninitiated.
cultured it, the whole entire thing.
Yeah, because this was all stuff that was relegated to secret societies, and for the most part, they were pretty good at keeping their secrets, and people who talked about it. I mean, you had to be like a guy like Crowley, who was also an intelligence agent, and I wonder if that was part of his mission as an intelligence agent to sort of bust up these other occult players so that the British intelligence could use their occult knowledge with impunity. And you see, Hitler doing that with his, special service group, whatever SS, Waften, those guys. I mean, those guys literally used the Skull and Bones death head as their symbol, and they were certainly the type to, they were the Gestapo. They went around and they made sure nobody else was practicing that stuff. They confined all of that. So I mean, that we're getting into a whole nother thing there, but Crowley was a part of the English Empire, and he was a spy, and I think he definitely had his hands in World War I in a way. We're gonna get there. You mentioned the Titanic before, and Crowley was definitely connected. But like I said, he wrote this book, The Book of Lies. This guy Theodore Roos, who essentially claimed that the OTO was inspired by the Illuminati, the real historical Illuminati, and he claimed that he was recreating the Illuminati. So that's what the Ordo Templi Orientis is, and Crowley, he has this book of lies that Roos thought, well, Crowley, you must be stealing our stuff because you wrote about, this in our book of lies. And Crowley's like, no, no, no. I knew this from this, that, and this, and that made them friends. Very similar to the way that Crowley got into the Order of the Golden Dawn. He kind of weasels his way into the Ordo Templi Orientis, and in a very similar fashion, like nobody mentions the OTO without mentioning Crowley, just like nobody mentions the Order of the Golden Dawn without mentioning Crowley. And even people have a misunderstanding of the two and often conflate the two for being the same group when they're not. And yeah, so it's like, you got to consider maybe Crowley was sort of Britain's inside man, who was kind of busting up these like German and Spanish and Mexican secret societies that were not aligned with the crown and the crown's interests. And obviously this was the way warfare was engaged that back then, it was spy on spy, magician and wizard on wizard. Like that's kind of, I think, a part of history that we don't really look at, and we don't really appreciate, but it very much inspired characters that we love, like Sherlock Holmes and all of the great sci-fi writers who incorporated things like this into their sci-fi work. So Crowley, he goes into the OTO, and in similar fashion he starts like publicizing stuff, and like he does all these like events where he's like on stage doing like ritual magic performances for crowds, and people are like, this guy's the most disgusting, shocking man I've ever seen. And this only adds to his like reputation as this like wicked person, which he kind of, at this point in his life, he really loved that reputation. And this is 1914 we're talking about, and obviously in Paris, things are a little more libertine. He has his partner Newberg with him, and they're doing these very intense rituals called the Paris Working, which involved a great deal of sex magic, and they even recruited a journalist named Walter Duranty to help out in this sex magic. And they were trying to invoke the gods Mercury and Jupiter, and they really didn't, Victor and Crowley, they did not last after this. Newberg began to distance himself from Crowley, and Crowley cursed him. So after being pretty much an abusive person to him throughout their entire relationship, he then ends their relationship by cursing him, which is nice because Victor Newberg actually didn't like to similar end, like didn't live a very happy life for the rest of his life. He was kind of plagued with like mental insecurity and like psychosis. And Crowley, although not really insecure, kind of had a similar strain of psychosis in his later life. But yeah, we have Crowley in Paris. Then he set sail for New York City. And this is right around the First World War breaking out. And he set sail for the United States aboard the Lusitania, which
Huh.
eventually sank and led the world, the United States to help out with World War One. So you have to wonder, like maybe there was some sort of ploy there, and Crowley had, some kind of knowledge of why the Lusitania ended up doing what it did, right? I mean, he clearly had some interest in helping out the English, and the English wanted America's support. And America at that point in time was very sick of war after the Civil War and all these sort of banana republic conflicts around the Pacific theater. They were like, no, we're not going to war. But then the Lusitania convinced them to help out with World War One. So
If you were
thus,
just being spy with him and just saying he's like NWO in the way that we know it now, like the CIA ops spreading stuff, he could have just planted a bomb in the Lusitania,
he could have just
and then
pulled
this
a
whole,
screw loose. I mean, he could have
yeah,
something as mundane as like, yeah, pulled like a screw loose, like let alone not like a bomb. I don't know, so
or yeah,
that
something,
well, but it could have been something as simple as like, yeah, sabotage that went unnoticed and led to the Lusitania sinking, and then they were able to place this cover story on it like, oh, it got sunk by Germans, we need to protect the United States from these awful Germans. And the English,
or
they
in a magical way, he could have done a spell on it.
right, right. Well, and the ocean is actually, yeah, I mean, a magical place. So there's a lot
Well,
of,
you're like the deep lake thing of Loch Ness, and then you're like, huh, where did the Lusitania? You look at these certain deep places in the ocean,
well,
what
even
ley
just the
lines,
magic
and
lore around like ships and captains and pirates. And I mean, there's a great deal of lore about that where there's certain things that are unlucky on a ship, and maybe, who knows, maybe Crowley knew what was unlucky for a ship, you know what events were unlucky for a ship to have take place on it. So I don't know, yeah, he
you're
could
not
have
supposed to have bananas on a boat.
bananas. Well, how do they ever make it
I don't know. Apparently, that's a thing in Jamaica. I think it's bananas. In Jamaica, if you bring bananas on the boat, they'll be like, they'll throw them right in the water or tell you to take them off.
so that sunscreen banana boat is like a curse?
Oh, maybe it is. I think it's bananas on the boat now. Now I can't remember if that's the wrong fruit. There's a
Clip it.
certain, yeah, I'll figure it out. I'll
That's our
totally find it, but I'll find out and put it at the bottom.
yes. Yeah. So he goes on the Lusitania and then makes it to New York City. And yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't put it past him to suggest that he had something to do with that, but it's not suggested by Tobias Churton or Rich Spence. So who knows? But he ends up writing with the Vanity Fair still, and working for an astrologer named Evangeline Adams. And he's doing all this sex magic in Turkish bathhouses. And he's also writing for a pro German newspaper called The Fatherland. And, people have pointed this out and said, oh, Crowley was a traitor. He was writing pro German stuff, and they used this to discredit him, almost as a way to like turn people from the spy story, right? Because, oh, Crowley could never have been a spy for England. He was a disreputable traitor who was sympathetic towards Germany. No, 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 no. He was in New York City writing propaganda so that the United States would be afraid of Germany and then compelled more to go along with Britain in this World War One. So, we have Crowley the propagandist who is, you know, kind of playing along in this role as a spy in the United States, helping out the British cause and undermining the German cause as he's pretending to be for the German cause. So, you know, kind of complicated, but when you look at what happened in you know, in light of this with World War II, it makes sense. And it's mentioned several times by Crowley that he feels so patriotic that he goes and he compels some friend of his to let him enlist as a spy. Oh, I do so great as a spy. Please let me go be a spy to fight these Germans in World War II. And they kind of laugh him off like, no, you're too old, you're too senile, you're too crazy to do something like that. But I think this is, again, just more cover up to like throw you off the trail, throw your nose off the scent that Crowley was actually a spy the whole time, and probably gave his, you know, occult expertise at that point from more of a you know, an insider kind of perspective, like a guy that they can call on and be like, hey Crowley, tell us about, you know, this thing, because you know that there's this Rudolf Hess guy who was like a Nazi wizard or something, this black magician that Hitler had hired, and he flew into I think Scotland trying to battle, I think Aleister Crowley or someone else. And the guy ends up taking a plane to England and parachutes over. He doesn't land where he thought he was going to land, and he gets arrested by the British authorities. So it seems like Crowley is still helping the British, even after he claims that he's not like an active spy, or after he, you know, claims that he wants to be a spy. You know, again, it's trying to throw you off the trail. But yeah, Crowley clearly was connected to a lot of strange stuff, as you could see on his regalia here. He has the Knights of Malta star sort of at the center there, and a bunch of uh, emblems and things from his time in the various secret societies, whether Golden Dawn or OTO or Freemasons and so on and so forth. He has a 33rd degree in Freemasonry. And you know, one of the interesting things that I'll say about Crowley again and World War II is all of that occult intrigue made its way into the CIA, obviously, and their approach to espionage and coercion. So, you know, although I haven't found like a direct correlation, I think it's worth pointing out that like Crowley clearly had an effect on the intelligence community. And maybe that's because the intelligence community had always been a cult. I mean, obviously, like people always say John Dee was the first spy for the, you know, first spy occultist for the Queen of England at the time, right? Queen Elizabeth. So it's definitely not far-fetched to suggest that this was a part of, you know, only a couple, 1 or 2 decades later, the CIA and making their protocol and all the different projects that they've got going on throughout the history. But yeah, Crowley, he traveled all over.
Especially if you go back to the idea of Barbara maybe potentially being related to Crowley and the Prescott Bush of it all and the whole formation of that, it's so many levels deep. And then there's other people that think we've always been under the Queen of England. And some people think there's lineage to the Queen Elizabeth and this whole thing of Barbara Bush. And so other people think that when you take Harry and Meghan, that's just a whole setup that pop culture wise, their child could potentially be the president of the United States. And then we're sitting under the royalty publicly. Like that would be the New World Order. Like the United Kingdom isn't necessarily just a crown. It's like United Nations, United Kingdom. It's like that is the setup that it's always going to be. We're just part of the United Kingdom, so we're all marked with the Queen's X.
Mm, mm. Well, yeah, and at that time when he was alive, it was like the height of the British Empire, right before they sort of their power waned. You know, I mean, it started to wane with the American Revolution, but they were still pretty substantial and sort of consolidating and transforming their empire into more of like a overseership position, which they've still retained that to this day. So especially when you look at their resource wealth. You know, it's the empire that the sun never sets on. You know, they have places all over the world, and they had guys like Crowley at their disposal. I mean, like I said earlier, he was just one of many spies who also dabbled in the occult, but he made his way all over the United States. He went up through the West Coast, all the way up to Vancouver, and then he came back towards the east. He went and did peyote in Detroit. He got the peyote from Park Davis, which is now kind of a big pharmaceutical firm, was then too. But yeah, he went to Seattle, San Francisco, Santa Cruz, Los Angeles, San Diego, Tijuana, sorry, Grand Canyon. So he's all over the place. He spent some time in Titusville, Florida, but all the while returning to New York, where he had kind of like a little apartment. And he also did a wilderness retreat in 1918 on the Hudson River. I'm really excited because I hadn't found this out until revisiting my research on Crowley, and that's not too far from where I live. So I want to go and check out this island on the Hudson River that he visited and see what's up. But
Yeah,
then,
totally.
yeah, then we get into, and I don't have slides for this portion of his life, so, but I do have my notes in front of me. And, you know, when it comes to Crowley, another event in his life that really like cast a bad light on him forever and also kind of like changed his personal life forever was this Abbey of Thelema, right? And the whole concept comes from Rabelais, who some scholars and some researchers say was kind of like a satanic priest or you know, a Gnostic priest. I'm not conflating Satanism and Gnosticism. I'm just like, there's a very wide spectrum of like interpretations of this guy Rabelais. But Rabelais writes about the Abbey of Thelema as he's kind of mocking Christianity. So Crowley loved that, you know, as someone who also enjoyed mocking Christianity to some degree. So he kind of based his thelemic ideas around some of that, and that's where the name Abbey of Thelema comes from. Now, there's some interesting things about this Abbey of Thelema. So it's in Italy, Cefalù, Italy, and you know, apparently there's like prostitutes, there's young boys, there's all kinds of weird stuff going on. You know, I don't rent boys is what the term is called, and you know, a lot of cocaine, young, again, young children with mothers present. So, you know, whatever happened, it's hard to say, but it got Crowley in a lot of hot water legally, and he left Italy. He was never charged with any crime, but you have to wonder, given what we heard about sacrifice, if Crowley maybe stepped things up and actually tried to, you know, physically sacrifice a person. And he was at that point in life, I mean, doing all sorts of drugs, right? Because the understanding of cocaine and opium back then was a little different. Like they didn't consider them, you know, life ruining drugs yet. They just, I don't know, maybe they knew how bad they were, but it wasn't as it wasn't as deterring as it is now, right? They were
Yeah.
just doing as much drugs as they wanted. So yeah, there, I mean, there was a cat that was allegedly sacrificed. That was one thing that, you know, people were very worried about. And the Benito Mussolini government basically was like, you know what, you're out of here, deported, abbey closed. So it's interesting because Crowley himself, I mean, he definitely probably, I mean, I don't know this for sure, but he probably would have appreciated a fascist government just because of his like political kind of taste. He wouldn't have liked, the ideological suppression or intellectual suppression, but he definitely liked a strong government. He was in favor of that. So it's kind of ironic in my mind that is where he ends up, with Benito Mussolini as the guy who kicks him out of Italy. Italy is sort of a hotbed of that kind of weird stuff in itself before the fascist government and like the mafia, which has some occult aspects to it as well. Italy's a very strange place, the Vatican
So
is
much.
yeah, all of the Rome, so even Paganica, which I just recently learned is a place in Italy, and it's also
I've never even heard of this.
well, it's a place in Italy. It's also what golf is based off of. So they had a game in the Roman Empire called Paganica, and that was basically like a precursor to the modern game of golf, where you'd club a ball around and try to get it into a hole. And I just found it interesting that they called it Paganica because the Romans were conquering all these like druids at the time, and what we're told are opposing pagan groups, right? They were pagan themselves before they converted as an empire to Christianity. But yeah, interesting, golf, totally unrelated to Crowley, but I've always had a suspicion about golf and why it's, an elite sport, where
Tennis, golf.
tennis too.
There's
Yeah, tennis is odd.
Yeah, there is definitely ritual that seems to go on with all of it, even down to the ball of it, calling it basketball
Mm,
and the numbers that they put on all the players and the symbology that they call each of the teams and when they play each other on what date and their Super Bowls and their Rose Bowls and their Cotton Bowls. And I just think all of it is one big ritual. But yeah, golf sus.
mm,
The land they get to play on, the people that get to play it, and the more elite, the harder it is to play a sport, the more ritual and magic I think that actually goes on that quote unquote green.
mm. Well, golf, I don't know if Crowley ever played around, but he might. Uh, he was in, like I said, the United States, and then after he got kicked out of Italy, he spent some time in Tunisia, then Paris and London, and bounced around a bit. He became the head of the OTO upon Theodore Roos's passing, and that was challenged by another German guy named Heinrich Trunker, who apparently took the OTO in a different direction. And there were some other guys like Carl Germer who wanted the OTO to go in Crowley's direction. And it's interesting, the OTO is still present in the United States and Europe, but apparently they're really like just a shell of a group. Like they claim they have 4,000 members, but the truth is they have 4,000 inactive members, and like among those members maybe like a few hundred active members. So it's was then and still is a very small group of people who are actually kind of participating in this stuff. But I do think, when you look at Crowley and his association with the intelligence agencies, and the elite circles, it's like maybe he was just left out of all of that and like took some of that stuff to the more working man artists communities because those are the people that accepted him. And maybe there's something similar to like these groups that perform ceremonial magic and even potentially sacrificing individuals. Maybe they just are part of similar organizations that were like ancillary or tangential, or maybe just like in the same milieu but not related. So, we can't discount that. But Crowley, after this, I mean, he just goes into drug fienddom. Like, he's trying to quit heroin, can't quit heroin. He's still writing. He wrote that very influential Diary of a Drug Fiend, and I think that is primarily like the vehicle that brings him into American pop culture, right? Because a lot of the artists that were influential in the 60s, they were also drug addicts themselves at some point in their life. And if you look into Dave McGowan's work, you see that drugs were not only just like a part of the drug scene, but they were like manufactured into the drug scene. They were presented through music onto the culture as a way, a vehicle for getting people hooked on drugs. So bands like the Grateful Dead would have like a house acid dealer, but they would also have like a gang of heroin dealers as well that would be associated with them later in their careers. And that's the same story with a lot of artists, unfortunately. I mean, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, right? John Lennon did heroin. Like, all of these like very influential artists of that time find themselves doing opium, and that's very much because of the power structure that's supplying the finances to promote this music and get this new industry off the ground, because it was very much a new industry. Entertainment, it didn't exist like that up until that time. I mean, Elvis was kind of like the first national act. Before that, it was primarily like the arts and high society community who would have like touring musicians. It wasn't like common people, aside from maybe like a local act or a place like Nashville that just always had music in it, right? So, you have to imagine that the music scene being pumped with drugs, and then Crowley having this reputation for doing heroin. I think that's really where you find this darker occult element coming into the music scene. And a lot of those people who are already doing heroin, I mean, that's such a life altering drug. If you come clean from that, it's not a stretch to go into the realm of black magic, because you've already kind of hit the abyss, so to speak, with your addiction. And I've never done heroin. I've never been addicted to, a drug like that. So I can't speak to that experience, but I'm sure it was very difficult and detrimental to
But
Crowley.
it's curious with the Opium War part, down to the World War One part, down to now he's in America, and like you're saying, this culture. So the biggest book to get published and to get printed and all this, these are all connections and propaganda pushes. So each place that the spy goes, and now he's pushing a rhetoric of the drug the same way like Kurt Cobain re-pushes it again. We watch the rinse and repeat cycle of the war, that they already told us, hey, we're going to use heroin and opium and cocaine and stuff to take down China. We already know that's what they did with this war. So then they come over and they're like, how are we going to take down America?
Right.
Same exact game plan.
Right. And, I'm playing on the safe side with all this. There's the potential that a researcher who's better than I can come in and back up a lot of the suggestions I'm making and take it a step further. But, I'm just erring on the safe side because I'm not, invested in this subject. I'm not writing a book about it. It's just something that I'm interested in. And also, there's so much hubbub about a guy like Crowley. It kind of becomes obnoxious after a while when you've done the research to hear a lot of stuff that doesn't amount to much. Now, that being said, if only the people were to focus on the stuff that's actually there instead of the things that are kind of given to us as disinformation to throw us off the trail, well, then I'd be for a flogging of Crowley. I'd be for their public statements against him, because they'd be backed up by the facts, not conjecture and rumor, which unfortunately makes every conspiracy theorist look bad when we just allow ourselves to not have the discernment and the discrimination to tell between rumor and actual fact. And with Crowley, it makes sense that people would consider him like this awful, evil black magician because, the occult revival was not, it wasn't like a popular movement. It was a subcultural movement. It was an intellectual movement. And it's also probably why a lot of this stuff stayed in the upper echelon with the elite. We talk about like more contemporary people that were strange. Crowley, he was fond of Gurdjieff. He met Gurdjieff, and Gurdjieff inspired someone like Frank Lloyd Wright, who I recently learned about. And Frank Lloyd Wright had a lot of weird things about him, and weird connections, and like possibly mind controlled people on his estate who, killed some people and burned down his home. The guy was an architect. I don't know if he particularly cared that it burned down because he could rebuild it, and yeah, there's a whole story there with Frank Lloyd Wright that my friend Recluse has been getting into on his show, The Farm. But yeah, Crowley, he goes off to Berlin after his time in London, and kind of this is all before World War II, after World War I. He's in Berlin from 1930 to 1938, and he tries to fake his own death. He puts out a lot of art at this time, and he is said to have met with Aldous Huxley at this time, who Aldous Huxley is definitely someone who's connected to the elite and the CIA and all of those groups that are part of the like kind of culture creator Tavistock style that led through that 60s. So that 60s era. So yeah, Crowley, you have clear connections. He's also an influence on a guy who's just kind of disgusting. This guy Kinsey, who kind of made it more what's the right term? He kind of like promoted these pedophilic concepts through his clinical pediatrician psychology work. So, it does go into those really gross realms.
Yeah, there's a lot of dark stuff in Kinsey's research.
Yeah, and Kinsey, he was,
and Hollywood does a really good job, like they always do, of sugarcoating it and making him look like an okay dude.
Yeah, and Kinsey was very much a part of like that Hollywood, like if affected by that Hollywood scene that was affected by Crowley, right? So
what's so funny? It just dawned on me right this second. Kinsey's scale is 1 to 7 of sexuality.
Well, yeah,
holy shit.
They like the numerology. I mean, I'm definitely, that's like I'm not really an expert in numerology, but there's a case to be made that like numerology and gematria has something to do with all this. S.K. Bain wrote a book connecting the 9/11 stuff to Crowley's writings somehow. So, whether or not Crowley knew that his occult writings would be used for that, I don't know that he could have known something like that, but it definitely, like, he is the prophet of this strange new religion that a lot of elites seem to follow. And not just elites, but like scientists like John Whiteside Parsons, who, famously blew himself up and died in an occult ritual in a laboratory. But he was a big part of like the JPL labs. And there are other people who know a lot more about Parsons than I do, but yeah, the Nazis came around and they were into the occult. Some people thought that Adolf Hitler was a Thelemite, that he had like converted to Thelema, and that's why he was into all this occult stuff. But it seems that the Nazis the Nazis abolished the OTO, and Crowley basically told people in the United States that Hitler was a black magician because of this. So maybe this is a part of, again, like Crowley, he's in Berlin, he's laying the foundation of something, he's putting out art, he's trying to fake his own death for some reason, and then the World War II comes along, and like he's saying, oh, Hitler's a black magician, and Hitler bans the OTO, right? So here he is again, like World War I, like Asia and China and Russia, all these scenes that he was involving himself in. He's like right there, smack dab in the middle. It's like this Forrest Gump idea. Like today in 2022, if you hear that Forrest Gump thing, you know what I mean. A guy
Yeah.
in every place, every important event that takes place, this guy just happens to be there. And I think, in that way, Forrest Gump is like showing us something about our reality. Like, hey, like, so all of these events are pulled off by the same people, and they use unwitting, like, recovering, like, what's the right, what did he grow up with? Forrest Gump, the fictional character, he had like polio or something. Like, we have these like victims who are like sort of on the lower end of intelligence, who are used as patsies, and they're involved in every major important event. Like, that's like the plot of Forrest Gump, that he's just like happens to be in all of these circumstances over and over and over again. And they don't, they're winking at you about that. They're not like, and then Forrest found himself, like, that's not really like implied explicitly, but it is implied. So there he is, World War II, Crowley. And he died during World War II, in 1947 on December 1st of chronic bronchitis. And he was a smoker, he was a heroin addict, he was probably doing a bunch of other drugs, but yeah, he's buried in, of all places, Hampton, New Jersey. And
Huh.
and yeah, it's just interesting, like, again, that Forrest Gump kind of concept, or archetype,
I think
right?
that's a brilliant connection to make. I've just done so many digs on just that movie and how every single part of it is a rewriting of history and a mockery in our face, even down to how you were saying the polio, which is probably a vax injury.
Right.
But they're like, oh, look, this poor kid. And even down to the Elvis, which is just, this is our first big propaganda push to let you know what a top 40 is. So you think you pick the top 40.
Right.
And it's just every single detail in that movie, down to when he opens his briefcase right at the beginning. You have the two ping pong paddles, and you have the red ping pong paddle, and then you have Curious George, which the guy who did Curious George also redoes the entire horoscopes, but nobody knows it about him. So it's like this like occult thing that guys like Tom Hanks would know. And so I bet you every single part. And then if you take Forrest just in that way, wow, what a perfect spy.
Yeah, well, and the unwitting, I mean, even just the fool on the tarot card, of like the person who like is the like a primary sort of, what's the right word? Like an effector, like someone who just by being in the presence of an event affects it in some way without even being conscious of it, right? Like that. I think it's suggesting that some of us have this like divine will, like Crowley's talking about. Do as thou will. He doesn't mean thou me, he means thou, the all. And Crowley, when he was on that Hudson River Island retreat, he was translating the Tao Te Ching. So, it wasn't all bad stuff. I mean, you look at Taoism is not something that is evil, in my opinion. Maybe there's been like evil monks who've practiced Taoism, but yeah, I think like Crowley, if he was like this evil dark wizard, like, I don't know that he would spend much time with that. And I don't know. I mean, again, we can't know for sure every aspect of his life, because he was responsible for a lot of the writing of his life. So it's like, you're taking his word for things, and then you're taking his enemies' words for things. You're taking the people that were like not really kind, you treated kindly by him. So it's an interesting kind of situation with him. But one thing that I will say personally, I bought the first tarot card deck I ever bought was his tarot card deck, the
That
book
was
of,
going to be the like in the questions of the last question. I was going to ask you what you thought of tarot cards in that deck specifically.
well, and it was the first one I ever got, because like I said earlier when I was talking about the cannabis connection with me personally, Like for whatever reason, my intuition drew me to Aleister Crowley. It wasn't like I had read something like, oh, he's a big bad evil guy, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm into that. Because like I wasn't into metal or like I remember my friend had like a Slipknot poster, and I was like, oh, that's horrible, like so I wasn't like the type of kid that was into that kind of stuff. But Crowley interested me because of the mysticism, and I got his tarot card deck because I had had a few tarot deck readings from people and they resulted in really interesting things. Like I had initially gone to see a fortune teller type person, not knowing that tarot cards were a part of that process. I just thought I was going to go and have my palms read or something. Like I didn't really know that much about tarot back then. But I was filled in by this tarot card reader that the girl that I was in a relationship with had moved on and met someone else while we were dating. She had met this person online, and this person was like a long distance relationship. I was only like 17 years old. So I was like sort of naive and sort of innocent and sort of like a sweetheart. For I was too old to be that sweet. I should have learned by then. But anyways, I needed that lesson. And yeah, it turned out to be true. And I had no idea, but it turned out that this girl, it was like a gamer, and she had met some guy on some online game and started dating him, long distance. And that's why she broke up with me. She never told me that. But I found that out, some months later, and that kind of stuck with me. And it wasn't that I wanted to do like things and like have the tarot cards there to like assure that, oh, I would get in the best relationship, or like it wasn't that. It was just like the fact that it worked made me very curious to see what else the tarot cards would do. And although I never became like a tarot card reader, it seemed like that was like the next step, was like, oh, well, you learn how to read for yourself and then you read for other people. I never wanted to do that. I've just like personally, I haven't touched the tarot cards in like few years, but when I was younger, I would pull them out in times of insecurity, and I would see what they had in store as a message. And now after that training, I've learned to look for other messages that don't involve cards, that don't involve the process, that involve my actual reality and nature. And so, Crowley's definitely affected the way I think about things in a way. The
I know
book,
some people out there think like tarot's woo woo or whatever, but I think the universe has a language.
yeah,
And if you just want to flip a quarter and say heads or tails, you could freeze it in the air, there's an energy on both sides of it to what you gave both sides of it. And you might know your decision when it's frozen in the air, but sometimes you really don't know your decision, and yes or no isn't enough. And so if there is a language and an attachment and an energy, and sometimes it's between the creator of the cards, and sometimes you can have an energy with both cards. Like you might look at the Fool and it gives you a different energy than me, and that's why our readings would be different, because it's the language from the universe to us right now. So there is this way that if you do need it, I do think tarot or even playing card decks or a quarter in the air, I do think there is energies and symbology from the universe. If every time you see a red cardinal it reminds you of your grandmother, maybe the energy of your grandmother is around you. It doesn't mean she's around me every time I see it. It's just that's the language of the universe to speak to you about that energy. So I do think there's energy attached to symbols and signs and cards, and it's specific to you. And some people are really, really good at connecting to your energy and they have their language between them and their tarot. And so it's really good. They can connect to the energy of the universe and talk to it for you. And sometimes it's just validating. It doesn't mean you're going to follow through with it. It doesn't mean you're not going to do it or whatever. But sometimes it's just like, I already thought that, like freezing the quarter in the air. Yeah. Like, I don't really need it to land. I already know what decision I wanted to make.
Yeah. Well, and what you're talking about is divination. I mean, tarot cards is like a type of mancy, right? There's a proper word for it, but like claromancy is rolling dice, right? So like there's all sorts of examples of divination. Geomancy, right? That's another type of divination where signs from the earth are sort of used for certain magical purposes. That's something that I've been researching a lot lately, but yeah, it's way more common than people imagine. Like divination is probably the most common form of magic, and it's practiced by priests. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the Yale University seal has a phrase on it, which is a divination tool. It goes back to divination tool. It means truth and light, but it also has to do with this thing that was on Aaron's breastplate in the Old Testament, and it comes from the black and the white stone, and the black and the white stone were used as dice, divination, the same way that people cast the I Ching, they throw, or maybe even in rural places, people like throw like tea leaves, or people throw like sticks and things. That's divination. The way it lands, the
Or
pattern.
waiting for a groundhog to come out of the ground.
That's true. That's true. I mean, I hadn't thought about it like that, but that's true.
I
The
always try to like
Satanic
blowing
Hill.
out birthday candles to Artemis in a round cake shaped like the moon and giving a wish up for another year of your life. That's magic, whether or not you're connecting it or not. And so we're like, when a priest walks into the room in a Catholic church with a sage, they're clearing bad energies out of the room.
Mm.
That's magical thinking. Like these are real, and it doesn't mean it's not real. And so I think there's like both sides to these crazy where in just the 3D of it, he could have totally just been a spy. In the
Mm.
magic of it, he could have just been a crazy magician. Both, he could have totally been working for the British government because we know the military spends tons of money trying to figure out all this psychic warfare and astral projection and dreaming and pretty much everything you watch on Stranger Things, LARPing and the energy of all these like role playing and playing out a battle and on a play before we actually do it, how much power there is to manifesting it.
Mm.
So you can see all the
Well,
angles.
and as egotistical as he was, he probably would have reveled in the chance to like be an occult, expert for the British intelligence. Like some at some point in his life, I'm sure that opportunity arose, but I don't know if you can systematically use magic in that way. I think that's one of the things that Crowley ultimately realizes that, he kind of he kind of missed the goal. Like he missed the mark. He was very arrogant, but I don't know if he's admitted it or thought of
The whole
that.
royal family is all Germans. And so then you have him going back to Germany and doing this, and he worked for the British
Oh yeah.
intelligence. So they like the royal family is just German all the way until you get right back to Harry and William, which are when uh Prince Charles and Diana, which is Winston Churchill's kin, like Spencer Churchill. So that's the next womb where there's actually England even involved in this German heritage anymore. So it's just curious how he goes through all these wars. We hear all these things about Nazis. You have the Secret Service agency that's set up in America that a lot of people always are like the CIA is the same as not CIA. It's the same thing. So it's just curious that he's the guy who touches the Disney guy and the Scientology guy and the NASA Nazi guy. And he's also British intelligence and how they're all German too. And I'm like, whoa, this is a whole crazy web.
Mm.
And every name you said all today that are rabbit holes of their own.
Oh.
That's kind of why I wanted to start with Aleister Crowley, just because he's the most pop culture version of and everything else you said. He's almost like this nasty little sticky pop culture glue that will come up later on in all these other threads.
Well, I certainly am not the conclusive expert. You could certainly do 100 more episodes on Aleister Crowley, and they'd all be equally interesting, as I hope this conversation was, at least my side of the conversation. And yeah, I really appreciate you pushing me to go back and look at this, because for a while I didn't want to look at it because I had a weird response from, that tinfoil hat episode, and
I had a weird response. It caused me to do shadow work.
what do you mean by that?
It was the first time the information was given to me in such an unbiased way. It wasn't just a hate or a love. It was such an unbiased way. My reaction to it was so much like Sam's. Like, even though it was like, I knew both of you on these two separate ends, but my reaction to the information, but I wasn't mad at you because of it, but it was just how you just stayed on track. You didn't change your tone with it. You just like, and so it still made all the information go into my brain. And it was always a subject that in the pop culture lore of it, I was just never going to look. I was just never going to look at it because I already knew what it was by my predetermined idea of what it was. And so all the rabbit holes that were just in that, just by having an open enough mind, that I don't know in the universe if I would have, if it wasn't you two guys talking about the subject in that way that day. And so it was, for me, it was just this first piece of knowledge that was kind of like the universe is like, you are ready for this now. It's time for you to like, it made me see like this dark part of the occult, or maybe the occult in general. Like, let me start looking at it in all these different ways. So it was a really big episode in my journey, I think, of my puzzle pieces, like re-looking at something again and realizing just because you looked at this once with these goggles doesn't mean you can't go back and look at it again and again and again. So even though what I thought I knew out of all the years in between that episode and today, now to look at it full spy goggles on, him just as a spy. This is what I kind of want to do with ideas, is that look at all and then the propaganda that we all have, and to actually say, okay, where did this come from? Where did this idea, and dissect it backward, that why are they giving us this narrative of this thing? And why are they allowing us to have this information of this thing? And then what are they trying to bury with this thing, kind of?
Yeah. Yeah. And I might have said this earlier, but my intention with that episode was to show where Crowley may be, involved in the darker aspects of influencing the culture that we have today. And I proved my point, I think, by Sam's reaction, right? And I also kind of failed to put this message across that you just really relayed. And I'm happy that you got that from this, that we put the spy goggles on. And I think Richard Spence would appreciate that because, again, Richard Spence, Tobias Churton, like that's where a lot of my understanding of Crowley comes from. So I have to give them tremendous amount of credit on this if I even need to. And I think like with that podcast, it quickly got out of hand. And that's fine. It is what it is. But I think like this whole like, satanic, esoteric, philosophy that people ascribe to Crowley, like, I don't think he would have liked that. Like, if he was alive today, like, he would be like, ew, Satanism, that's disgusting. Like, there's a certain part of me that wants to say but then there's another side of me that's looked at him and thinks, no, he would have been complicit in that kind of stuff. So it's still like it's for any one person to make their own opinion. I don't want to make like a conclusive statement on this person, because at the end of the day, he is just a person, just like I'm a person and you're a person. All people are capable of tremendous good. They're also capable of tremendous evil. And I don't think Crowley was on the side of good for most of his life, considering his associations with, all of these weird espionage people. And then also, given what we know about the occult, I have to like check that with saying like, but did he know that he was giving all this out so that a guy like me who just wants to learn about life and be a better person, was he putting that out there so that I could use that for a betterment of myself that doesn't like compromise anyone else's betterment, right? Because I think that's altruistically what we all want to do, is make a beneficial impact on our lives while also helping others. I mean, when we really get down to, the top of Maslow's pyramid of needs, so to speak, if we could even go by that, like that's the ideal, is to be a better person and also somehow make society better, right? At least that's what I've come to so far. Maybe in 5 years my mind will change on that, but and I think Crowley, like in a very diluted way, thought he was doing that. Just like any person who thinks that they're a good person thinks that they're doing good. But like Winston Churchill, like he thought he was great. He also knew Crowley. They were friends to some degree. They respected each other. And Winston Churchill, terrible guy. He should be mentioned with Hitler and Stalin as a killer, but he's not, because he was on the Allied side. And again, like this is the trouble with history, is we can't ascribe like these emotional charges to people and expect to go anywhere. So as much as I do get fired up about stuff like that, and I do want to protect all the children, and I do want to live in a world where that kind of evil doesn't go on, we're not going to fight it by being immature about it. And that's directly why I got interested in Crowley, and why I presented the topic to Sam, and why
And
we
spreading misinformation. It's the same way as if you call everything that doesn't feel good to your spirit a Nazi, 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 Nazi.
right.
Now somewhere we lose what the meaning of that was. Racist, 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 racist. Now we lose the meaning. As, oh, this guy, abuser, abuser, me too, me too, me too, me too. Now somewhere it's like we're losing the meaning of all these things by calling everyone everything and not really knowing. So it's like when it just comes out with this blanket idea and everything is pedophilia, Pizzagate, and also not saying that Aleister Crowley wasn't, but saying that it can't always just be blankets on these things, even how many different orders you say all get attributed to him, and how different they all are from each other, and how many people that may or may not been his friends or enemies, but get written about in history all the times together. So it's just,
well, and he's thought of as like this awful lefty who like made the far left like into all these like terrible occult diabolics. But the people in the OTO today, funny enough, are alt-right, which is very strange. I mean, not that I'm politically, putting my stance out there. I'm not alt-right, I'm not alt-left, or any variation of any of those. But it's funny that like Crowley himself had that conservatistic mindset from being part of England, being loyal to the regime at the time. And his OTO, which again, he didn't invent the OTO, he just kind of branded himself onto it. They're, again, a very small group as far as I've learned from other researchers. They don't have a big impact on society, but they do have a very pointed interest in the alt-right, which is interesting.
And maybe the satanic, don't look over here anymore. Once we label it satanic panic, in the same way you brought up Damien Eccles, don't look over here anymore. Don't look into the real occult of it. Don't look into the real maybe trafficking of it. Don't like the Franklin scandal. Maybe don't look over here anymore, because it makes some people, because of the religious upbringing, I don't even want to look. If it's Satan involved, it's too dark, when it might just be so many levels of espionage and drug running and gun running that, but if they just satanic panic you,
well, how do you keep your sheep in line? You get them so afraid of the shepherd that they never question them, right? So I mean, I don't know, it seems like that could be a part of it, where they smoke screen all these satanic imagery so that people never get to the heart of the fact that the Federal Reserve is evil and it's enslaving us, or people never get to the heart of the fact that all of their religions have like these sinister people at the top. So like, whatever the conspiracy that it is, I'm not pointing those as the grand conspiracy, but whatever the grand conspiracy is, there's an element of like, maybe they demonize the occult because the occult is a pathway to power that would then challenge them, right? That's personally where I stood to get interested in this stuff. And what I found is there are a lot of people who are like into the occult for like personal development reasons, and a lot of Crowley's defenders are from that persuasion of like, no, man, you don't understand. I use ceremonial magic in replacement of traditional religion because it helps my life, and for the, so it's a very complicated thing. I don't know that the occult is that road to salvation, now that I've looked at it enough. But I do think that, this idea of a superhuman is a very like enticing concept. And it's probably part of the espionage of like the occult and like getting people into this idea that, oh, you can be superhuman, and maybe there are ways that you can be superhuman, and those ways are delegated only to the elite and kept hidden from everyone else. And maybe because of the internet, we've broken past that barrier, and now it's all out there, right? So now they can't hide it from us. They have to just discredit it by demonizing it. That way, if people do find it, oh well, society will turn on them because they're devil worshippers. That could be too good to be true, right? And that could, there's so many different angles. I mean, you look at like ghost encounters, you look at like people who get abducted, people who have like weird succubi type experiences, or sleep paralysis. Like clearly there's a physical thing going on in those situations. There's a mental thing going on in those situations. Is it all a part of the same phenomena? Is it all a part of the same like methods, like the occult, and what happens to these people in these weird situations? Like they're one and the same. It's a part of an occult. That's where I've been looking at, like where that goes. And I don't know, Crowley, I think it's disappointing to get to the end of the Crowley road and be like, yeah, he wasn't like chopping the heads off of babies to a certain extent, because not that I'm in favor of that horrible idea, but like that's like the impression that we've gotten from the fringe culture, is that he's this big bad mean guy. And I don't know if it's all that it's made out to be, but I also think that there is real evil within his life that needs to be pointed out. So
he could have been a super wizard, he could have been a super spy, or he could have been Forrest Gump.
I think I'm happy with going with the Forrest Gump explanation for Crowley.
I like that. I like that at the end of it all, Aleister Crowley is Forrest Gump.
I don't know if that's a elucidating title for an episode, but it would be a fun title for this episode. If it might confuse more than it explains, but definitely, if they get to the end, they'll understand why.
I love it. And before you go, will you tell everyone everything you're up to, where to get a hold of you, how to follow you, where to buy merch or support you? Tell them all the goods of My Family Thinks I'm Crazy.
Thank you. Yeah. So shout out to all the Project Chaney listeners who also listen to My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. If you're new to my show, go to myfamilythinksimcrazy.com. I'm also on Rockfin and YouTube and Patreon, and I just started a Substack so that when I do these sort of research presentations, they don't just like lie in my computer. I want to put them out on Substack. So some of this stuff that I talked about Aleister Crowley, that's my own original thoughts, are going to be put on my Substack. And then I'm going to maybe put some stuff like citing my sources of why I think what I think. And so people can go to my Substack if they want more about Aleister Crowley, and all of the links to that can be found on myfamilythinksimcrazy.com.
I love it. I call myself a conspiracy philosopher. Ooh. I just like to, and so I think for you, you're kind of you're not a theorist as much as a realist. You will talk about conspiracies that happen, but you like to talk about them in a really real way.
Well, on my show, I think in person, I'm a little more, when it's not being recorded,
then we'll smoke a blunt and you're like, oh my gosh, what if you'll go there?
Yes,
you'll go there with me.
when
Okay.
when I'm not on the air, I'm a little more free tongue of like what I'll go on the record saying, I guess. But yeah, that being said, I do have tours that I give of New Haven. If you're on the East Coast, you're listening on the East Coast, or you want to make a trip up to Connecticut, I'm gonna put something on the website soon that'll be like a calendar so people can see when I'm doing tours. But I've done a lot of research into New Haven, and I've found out all this occult architecture is going on here, and I want to put it all together in a tour. I've given a few tours already this year, none quite like what I'm planning. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, in-person stuff, and maybe hearing Mark's off the record thoughts, look for my tours, because I'm going to be giving occult tours of strange New Haven, Connecticut.
I love this. I think more people should be doing this of their towns. And it's something that I appreciate so much about, I think, Juan's podcast, one-on-one podcast. And a shout out to Emily Moyer while I'm at it, just because I brought up the sports thing in golf and tennis earlier. And she does a podcast where she really goes into all the background
When
of
you
that.
said that, I thought of her thoughts on, what is it, Rafael Nadal. I was like, yeah, she talks about him a lot. She was actually just on my other podcast, Esoteric America, where we get into that, like more local, esoteric. Specifically, we had her on to talk about Austin, Texas. The whole month we've done episodes on Austin, Texas. So next month we're going to pick a different city, and each month we look into a city and find out what's weird about that city or town. So if you like that kind of stuff, check out Esoteric America on my
That
YouTube
is awesome.
channel. Yeah, she was our last guest.
That is awesome. Yeah. So perfect. Anything else you want to tell them about?
That's all. Yeah, I mean, I do a couple other things that are I could spend time talking about, but that's all for now. myfamilythinksimcrazy.com is the best place to find everything.
Mystic Mark, thank you for coming to Project Chaney and telling me about the beast, Aleister Crowley, who is probably more like Forrest Gump. And thank you guys for listening to another episode. Make sure you hit the like and subscribe. And for my audio listeners, go over to YouTube and check it out. I'm going to be getting better at production as I go, and editing and everything we talked about. So please go over it and get a visual as well. So thank you guys. Bye.
So she has been Chaney, and now she's off to smoke a blunt. See you next Tuesday, you fucking cunts.